The story begins with a solar eclipse, with shards of rock flying in the air, people's faces carved into the rocks themselves, and metal pipes stuck into the ground. A monster with 6 red eyes and several rows of teeth appears. It growls with its mouth wide open and spits saliva everywhere. A young man with a backpack and sleeping bag over his shoulders, armed with a dagger, screams and fearlessly attacks the monster, looking straight at it. The centipede-like monster lunges at the man, throwing him on his back and pinning him against the rock. The man stretches out his arm and thrusts it into the beast's mouth, impaling it. The monster continues to pounce on the man, but he clenches his teeth and presses his dagger into the beast's mouth. Something that looks like blood begins to spurt. The pressure makes the man's hand shake, and he clenches his teeth even tighter, not letting the monster swallow himself, and holds the dagger in the beast's mouth. Finally defeated, the monster falls next to the man, raising a cloud of dust. The guy sits exhaustedly, leaning his hands on the ground. Breathing heavily and holding the dagger in his hand, the boy wipes his face with his sleeve and continues to watch the beast, looking at it intently. The man says that he finally put the monster down with his own strength and is interrupted, addressing him as a no good. The man looked away tiredly. During the eclipse, several monsters attack, and a group of guys fight them. One guy jumps up and wants to strike the flying thing. The red-haired guy yelled to the man what he was doing there, and since he became a porter, he should do his job and collect the drops. The other guy asked the guy if he was blind and couldn't see the corpses of the monsters. After all, they didn't take someone like him to hang around. The guy apologized. The couple turned around and headed forward, leaving the guy confused, calling him a useless piece of work. The lad's hair fell over his face. He stared detachedly after the departing warriors. The world had changed after discovering the abyss. The guy covered in blood droplets quietly cursed. The abyss is another dimension, where monsters that can't be imagined really exist. Now a group of experienced fighters are fighting them. After the appearance of the abyss, people began to awaken extraordinary powers, with which they destroy monsters and study the abyss. Because of this, the evaluation criteria is no longer based on personality or diligence. Only the rank at awakening plays a role. A high rank is a good life. A guy starts collecting magic stones after destroying monsters by other people. The man looks at the stone in his hand and thinks he is only a rapist, in charge of the baggage of the awakened and himself unawakened. The guy shouted that he had collected all the trophies this way and thought that by the time he was 35, he didn't even have a status window open. The man thought that as long as he remained like this, he would never see a life like theirs, and froze with a look of horror at the departed. Turning completely around, the man sees that those who were in the team have been killed, bloody bodies lying everywhere. The red-haired man and the guy with the mohawk are also defeated, even though they were yelling at him just a few minutes ago. The man is shocked by what's happening, rounded his eyes and asks how it's possible that everyone is dead. The horror of it makes the guy sweat. The guy heard a voice behind him. He says that the last one left. The man turned around and saw a powerful monster with horns and covered with skulls. The man looked questioningly at the enemy and realized that it was a monster, Esranga Asmodeus. On his face there is nothing but burning red eyes. The boy turned around, exposed his blade and prepared to fight, shouting, sweating and looking at the beast with wild eyes. The monster stretched out all its limbs towards the guy, at least 6 of them, and they streamlined with a purple haze. One move of the monster and the guy loses his arm. He is so surprised that he loses the ability to move and think. The man falls screaming in pain, holding onto his arm while the monster stands still and watches. The injured man lifts himself up and stares at the monster with clenched teeth, asking what the hell this is all about, his eyes red and tears coming out. The guy's eyes bulge. The monster comes close to him, changing its color to black. A spark leaps from his finger and hits the man in the head. A trickle of blood runs down the man's face. The spark turned into a kind of outgrowth, and the tip hit the man's forehead. Something broke off in him, and he realized everything. The guy looks at the enemy, and in his head there was a question, whether he will die now. His eyes filled with tears and flowed down his cheeks. He is in shock. Life flashed before the man's eyes. He remembered that his parents died in a car accident. At school, the guy was constantly humiliated and ignored his whole life because of the awakening. The guy kneels in front of the monster. A thin energy thread connects his head and the monster's finger, which sucks the guy's life force. The man stares intently and doesn't move. Wondering if this is how he's going to die as a mere porter, he starts cursing both himself and life. Scolding, the guy bites his lip, squeezes his cheekbones, and orders himself to wake up. There is a core inside the man's body that has been sleeping all this time, and suddenly, it glowed awakening. Suddenly, before the eyes of the guy played thousands of lights. They are like comets flying in space, and he heard that all the conditions for awakening fulfill. A golden staircase appeared in front of the boy. leading to a long-haired white man who came out of the portal created by the playing lights. The man was covered in sweat. Looking forward, he questioningly studied the scene in front of him, multicolored lights shining everywhere. Standing in the rainbow lights was a man, his long hair fluttering in the wind. The man quickly turned around, looking at the monster. There is no limit to his surprise, because he had just been in the clutches of the enemy and under his control. The guy sees himself from the side. He is lying in front of the monster unconscious. The picture begins to distort, as if someone shook the water. The man turns his attention to his opponent, responding that Asmodeus has frozen, but his eyes are still blazing with red fire. A voice was heard from behind the guy. Laughing, he asked why the guy cared that Asmodeus had stopped. The light image was getting closer, and the man opened his mouth. At a complete loss, the man turned around with bulging eyes and kneeling asked who he was, the one who appeared in front of him so unexpectedly. The image smiled and replied that he didn't know who he was, but he was a king to some people and the guy shouldn't worry about it. Suddenly, the king appeared on the throne, raised his hand to his chin and said that from this moment, he gives the man power. The guy, dumbfounded by such a statement, thought about the king, the power, and what the hell this creature was talking about. Maybe he's just like Asmodeus. As if reading the guy's mind, the creature said that it was not good to be so distrustful, which confused the guy. The king said that he admired the man's will and tenacity, so he chose him. The planets flirted around those present, disappearing in a burst of light. The king added to make the guy think that such a miracle would never happen again. And the guy shouted, asking what he meant he had been chosen. The guy, confused, asked what was going on and cursed. The king, laughing and disappearing, replied for the guy to wait patiently for his time. The king added that the day when everything would fall into place would come, and then they would meet again. The boy's eyes are illuminated by a bright light, but he stubbornly looks forward. Suddenly, the fanged mouth of a monster appears from the abyss, and the king hands the lad his key. It is he who emits so much light. The man hears voices talking about being asleep and completely ignores them. Opening his eyes slightly, he sees one swinging a palm at him. Deciding to wake the man up, one with a satisfied expression wishes him a good morning and forcefully slaps the face of the man who has just opened his eyes. The man's cheeks swelled up in an instant and his eyes folded into a pile, the bully asking if he had woken up. A man with a snide smile hovered over the guy and said that he could only reach him with his fists. The other two behind him also laughed. The guy immediately recognized them. They were Ba Hyuk-soo and the bullies from high school. Only how did they end up here? He remembered how they bullied him at school. Thinking about it, the man realizes that he was absolutely now in the abyss and remembered the power, and the bully strikes again. The guy raises his tired eyes and an incomprehensible inscription in the form of RMN symbols looms. A blur appears in the man's head with all the given opponent's name, age, rag, and skill. This dumbfounded the man. Noticing the age of the opponent, the man concluded that it was 16 years ago and laughed as he received the blows. Pinned against the wall, the guy laughed, tilting his head back. His opponent stunned by this reaction and surprised to see him freeze, leaving his arm hanging in the air. Hyuk took a step back. With a grimace of displeasure, he asked what was wrong with that guy, if he was crazy. But all he heard in response was laughter. With rage, Hyuk shouted a mad at Kim and asked if he really wanted to get hit in the face. Instead of answering, a fist flew at his opponent. With great force and anger, Kim hit Hyuk in the jaw. Blood spurted and his eyes covered. He was turned 180 degrees. The other two guys were dumbfounded by what they saw, one of them glaring at his friend, the other keeping his eyes on Kim. The guy smiled and realized that he too now had power and was awakened. Kim was happy with that thought. After he punched his opponent, he was left standing leaning forward with clenched fists and tears in his eyes. The three froze in their seats, Hyuk still lying defeated by a single blow. Kim's face has changed and he wipes away his tears with his hand, now looking confidently at his assailants. Seeing Kim as a nobody, the two rushed at him with a ferocious look, one gathering a fire skill in his hand, the other ice, hoping to win by sheer numbers. Deftly passing under the first opponent's hand, the guy easily dodges and the fire attack passes him by. He clenches his hand into a fist. The confused opponent was confused, and Kim hit him in the chin with his fist with a powerful punch. The ice sorcerer attacked next and was also hit in the stomach with a kick, but he managed to defend himself slightly by creating a small ice armor. Kim wondered to himself and thought that for 35 years, for all that time, he had been doing his best. The guy had been doing physical training, meditating and gathering energy in his body. Kim studied all the information about monsters and the abyss, reading many books. Kim was interested in various skills, even martial arts skills, as well as melee and ranged combat. And now the guy was sure that he could not lose to such weak opponents. who again stood up to rush at him with shouts. In a flash, the guy hit one of them in the face with his fist, and the second one was kicked again, but in the head area, so he scattered them in different directions. The opponents fell unconscious, raising a cloud of dust. Kim didn't expect the other, because they don't know even the most rudimentary basics. He exhaled with a satisfied smile. He had defeated 3 people today. Battered but happy, Kim slammed his fist into his palm and said it was time to resume training. When he heard a rustle, he turned his head so sharply that sweat dripped off his face and he cursed, focusing his attention on the source of the noise. Hyuk, who had gotten up after the blow, questioned what Kim had said and whether he was really awakened, and he covered himself with stone shards and called the guy names. Putting on his stone armor, the opponent muttered that Kim was about to die, becoming increasingly covered in stone growths. Hyuk filled with anger. Applying the stone skin spell, the opponent lunged forward, putting his hand forward, folded into a fist, and covered in stone. Kim crouched down, keeping his eyes on Hyuk, and dodged his opponent's powerful blow, small stones flying in different directions. A second blow followed, so fast that Kim didn't even have time to see his hand, and his opponent managed to catch him with a piece of stone. Jumping aside, the guy did something unusual. His eyes reflected the opponent flying from above, which undoubtedly surprised him. Hyuk jumped up high enough, despite being covered in stone, and put both hands behind his head to deliver a powerful blow to Kim. The opponent collapsed to the floor with a stone meteorite with great speed, piercing the flooring and kicking up a cloud of dust. Lifting himself up in the wind-blown dust, Hyuk naively assumed Kim was finished and let his guard down. The guy appears from behind, kicking up dust with his powerful attack. His opponent sensed it, shifted his eyebrows, and widened his eyes. The opponent quickly turned his head and looked at the guy with eyes full of rage, an unkind light gleaming in his eyes. As he turned, Hyuk aimed his stone fist at the boy again, but he clenched his teeth and dodged it, preparing to attack again. Kim looks at his opponent carefully and strikes again, blood droplets and pieces of stone flying out. Hyuk smiled, the veins on his face bulging, seeing the guy's hand covered in blood, and asked what he was doing. The guy thought he hurt himself when he hit him, and now he's already fighting off the next attack by folding his 2 palms in front of him and tensing up excessively. A sharp pain shoots through him, and he flies away from his opponent, trying to slow down with his legs. Kim's back falls on a pile of rocks and he starts coughing, his hair falling over his face, which is stained with blood. Hyuk laughed and said that Kim didn't know his own limits, since he'd made a mess of things, and asked if he'd come to his senses. Hyuk came close and said with a mocking grin that Kim was the lowest awakened moron and clenched his stone fist. The opponent looked at the guy with a wild look and asked what he was going to do now. Would he run away like he just did? The opponent doesn't stop and asks the battered guy lying in the stones if he will try to fight with his awakened skills. Kim lies unmoving and thinks about the fact that everyone awakened gets a skill and a rank. The guy knows that there are levels from rank EPH, who are almost no different from normal humans, to rank S, who are called monsters. Kim realized that all he got was a skill that nothing is known about, also the lowest rank. There is no chance against Hyuk. A grimace of surprise slipped across his opponent's face, looking intently at the guy he had defeated. The guy put the hand on which the bracelet was hanging on his knee, and his body began to be covered with red and black aura mixed together. Kim stood up holding his knees and smiled. From behind his back, strange roots-like growths began to appear, and he said that he would not lose. A red vortex swirled around the guy, and he bent as if from the weight. The opponent was dazed and not believing his eyes, shouted what the hell it was. The dumbfounded Hyuk asked if he was really awakened, because the guy was weak, but he tensed up and his eyes bulged. The guy looked at his hand, which is enveloped by a multicolored haze, thought, this is the hunt. He feels the magic flowing through his veins. Tiredly looking at his opponent, the guy's eyes changed color and even out of them went a haze, and his opponent shouted that it was impossible. The opponent reincarnated with a monster and pounced, first flashing red eyes, and Kim watching him trying to understand how his power works. Putting her hand forward, she was covered in several smokes of different colors. Suddenly, something like tentacles covered with fiery claws appeared and a click sounded, leaving behind bright circles. The blow hit Hyuk. The opponent is stunned by the attack. A powerful energy comes out of the guy's hand, which destroys his stone magic. Kim's eyes burn red. He continues to exude energy more and more confidently and powerfully, piece by piece shattering Hyuk's shield cover. The guy pressed his lips together and red energy swirled around his hand. The color of the guy's eyes changed again, the iris turning white and the pupil shrinking, a circular vortex swirling in front of his hand. The enemy screams and holds on with his last strength. Stone by stone, the armor flies off his face, and he begins to be covered in Kim's energy. The vortex swirled with such force that it began to lift everything around. The remnants of armor flew off the enemy, and the energy hit him in the chest. On a nearby rooftop are guys. They are engrossed in business. Some are chatting merrily, some are looking at their phones, when energy appeared behind their backs. Suddenly a whirlwind that looked like a tornado in shades of red and black swirled, and it eclipsed the daylight. A column of dust mixed with rocks rose up and gradually began to subside and dissipate. Kim stood in the dust with his arm outstretched forward, and black and red waves of electricity shot around his body like electric sparks. His opponent is knocked unconscious by the impact, his gaze fading and smoke billowing from his body. Sparks like short-circuiting sparks surround him as well. Hyuk falls at the guy's feet without feeling, kicking up dust, and Kim looks down at him. The guy, covered in sweat, exhales a sigh of relief and hears in his subconscious that the hunt has stopped and the rank of the hunted target has been raised. The guy's hand turned red, smoked, crackled, and rocks began to grow. Kim was getting a new skill. A moment later, the guy's hand was completely covered in stone, and he got a stone skin. The boy returned to the school and entered the classroom. The girl sitting in it turned around and looked at him with surprised eyes. Kim had dragged the defeated opponents on himself. They hung unconscious on his shoulders. He left one at the entrance to the office. The guy breathes heavily and lifts his bloody, tired face and greets the girl, continuing to hold the two on his shoulders. The girl had a trickle of sweat running down her face and looked questioningly at the guy and shouted, staggered. After the fight, Kim took the children with Bahyoksu to the infirmary, and they were placed on beds to recover. The nurse used healing to tend to Kim's wounds. Sitting opposite each other, she took his palm in her hands. The nurse asked the guy in surprise how they all hurt themselves so badly, and he replied by lying to her that they fell down the stairs so there wouldn't be any unnecessary questions. Kim went outside and slowly walks up the road up the mountain, thinking that he is now fully healthy, and it's great. He has awakened and gotten his revenge on Hyuk. The guy moving forward looks as if into the void that the problem is hunting. He thought he would have to train his whole life, but his rank went up after one single fight. He now had an E rank. The guy wondered if the rank should have stayed EPH, but that power overcame the C rank, and he was even able to appropriate the skill of a defeated opponent. Kim steps further. He can't stop thinking why this king gave such power and why he sent him back. He didn't notice how his shadow took on the image of the king. The guy has a lot of questions piling up. He stops and looks forward confidently. He knows one thing he is obligated to do. Kim walked up to the unusual building. He stood in front of it and put his hands in his pockets. Tilting his head, he looked up and decided to learn more about hunting. The boy continues to look up and smiles, thinking how long it's been since he's been home. Kim was visited by memories of staying with his uncle after his parents died. Back then, he was a jolly, rumpy-haired boy. The boy grinned, and a gentle smile from the memories appeared on his face. The young man quietly opened the door and entered the house, thinking that his uncle would be back late and he should look for information on similar skills. Crossing the threshold and peeking into the room, the boy froze on the threshold, looking closely. In the center of the room, there were 4 strange men, one sitting on a chair, 2 in masks standing on the sides, and a boy sitting on his knees on the floor and opening something. The boy recognized the man, blushed, covered with sweat, and called him by name. Questioningly, he was his uncle's son. Kim looked at the boy with the same surprised look, put up his hand and called him Hwang Jae-yong questioningly, asking why he wasn't in school. Kim's eyes slowly widened at what he saw, stunned, and a drop of sweat ran down his forehead. Mentally cursing at the kid, he notices that a box of his uncle's savings is lying on the floor, bills and coins sprinkled on the floor. Kim knows that even before his regression, the kid wanted to hang out with the hooligans. He stole all the money from the house and raised a ruckus. Now he is justifying himself to the gangsters. Hwang approached the head of the gang and whispered something in his ear. He stood up and put his hand on the kid's head and made a grimace. Kim realized that something is going to happen today. He watches the hooligans with a wary face, and the gangster asked who it was, and it was John's cousin. The bully steps forward and steps on the box of money and says, if Kim doesn't want to get fingered, let him go where he's going. The guy clenched his fists. The opponent said they would only take what they needed and leave. Stepping even closer, put his hand on Kim's head and called him an unawakened Hyungnam. Kim looked at the bully tiredly. Not a single muscle trembled on his face. The guy smiled widely and contentedly and said it was perfect. Kim said he wanted to test something. The thug looked at him in surprise, but something was flying at him with great speed. In the blink of an eye, the guy strikes his opponent in the chest and he is blown to the floor by the feces with such force that even the coins flew in different directions. From such a strong blow, the bully opened his mouth and saliva flew out of it. The bandit coughed and his eyes turned white. The henchman standing to the side tensed with surprise and took up stands ready to attack, and Kim's cousin opened his mouth wide in amazement. The bandit looked at Kim in a daze, sweat beading down his face, and the guy hovered over the top, preparing to deliver another blow. Through his fingers, Kim sees his opponent dazed and drenched in sweat, yelling for him to stop. Stopping his palm in front of his lying opponent, the guy mouthed the hunt, one hand holding his opponent's palm. Those watching kept their eyes on them. Kim looked at his opponent, satisfied with his victory freezing over him. He grinned. Suddenly the guy trembled and his eyes rounded. The hunting skill didn't work, which surprised Kim. Kim let go of his opponent and looked at his hands, and the frightened and confused opponent looked at him questioningly, not expecting such a turn. The guy got all wet with excitement, pointed his hand at his opponent's face, and was perplexed because hunting doesn't work. While Kim was at a loss and staring at his opponent, he came to his senses and brought his hand to strike. With a curse, the opponent grouped himself and struck Kim in the jaw with his fist, and he recoiled from the force. The guy flew backwards and hit the floor, shaking the air, and a wheeze escaped from his chest. The enemy had already jumped to his feet and took up a position between his two buddies, shouting at Kim to die and pulling his arm forward. One of his cronies put his hands together and conjured chains, which were filled with his energy, and sent them at Kim with a loud clinking sound. The second one put his hand to his mouth, exhaled poisonous gas, and also directed it at the guy to poison him. And the main bully, supported by his cronies, with a satisfied face, opened his hand and released thorny vines from it. The triple attack of the awakened flew at the boy, and he leaned forward, wiping his face with his hand. Kim, noticing the attack, opened his eyes wide and sweat dripped from his face as he raised his head. He quickly begins to think of a plan. The triple blast is devastating and blends together to explode. A blast wave rips from the four sides of the house through the windows. Sparks of compound magic flickered through the poisonous fog, and the bandits waited for it to dissipate to see their progress. The trio stood in a row, and the main one said that since Kim dared to pretend to be awakened, they should put him in his place. The bandit noticed something unusual and twitched. He looked forward in shock. The guy who should have been chained, poisoned, and shredded by spikes was standing in a blob of collected magic, trying to absorb it. A fanged and multi-eyed monster appeared above the guy and confirmed the use of chain, poison, and bleeding. Thanks to the mystical power, the resistance was successful. Kim, covered in stone skin, smiled contentedly. The guy targeted the ringleader. He doesn't understand what's going on. The power suddenly didn't work, and then reflected the skills as it wished. The bully saw the guy and his awakened monster and opened his eyes full of terror, for they were headed towards him. At breakneck speed, with a black lightning bolt, Kim strikes the thug in the chest, pinning him to the floor, and the floor begins to fail beneath him. With frantic glowing eyes and a smirk on his face covered in stone skin, Kim realized that this skill was damn powerful. The unconscious opponent flies down, the guy knocks his tooth out and breaks his nose. The attack threw rocks from the broken floor into the air. The guy quickly regains his human form and stands in front of his opponents in a victorious pose with his head proudly raised. Kim looked at the defeated enemies, put his hands in his pockets and smiled. He had defeated 3 of them alone, and this time he was almost unharmed. He realized 2 things. The status window can only be seen by the awakened. It shows information, but not to the fullest extent. And the second thing is that hunting has a passive effect that is not in the description. It reflects and nullifies the skills that change the status. Kim thought about it and put his hand to his chin. He decided that in time he would be able to confirm his assumptions. The boy tiredly held his gaze in front of him and realized what he was most interested in. Waking up from his musings, Kim saw his cousin in front of him, kneeling, bent over, and folding his arms in front of him. Kim asked what he was doing. Jian raised his head and nervously said that he had reflected on his behavior and asked him to forgive him just this once. The cousin said he'd play doggy or shine Kim's shoes. It didn't matter. He'd do whatever his brother told him to do, and he thought it was pathetic. Kim made a disgruntled grimace. He knows the cousin was a dog, but he didn't know it was that bad. And the kid really barked, standing on his knees. The kid thinks that the main problem isn't the cousin, but another event that's supposed to happen tonight when a monster appears over the city. Kim told his brother that he was forgiven, then looked up and stammered in disbelief and asked if it was true. Dog ears grew on his head, and a spot appeared around his eye. In return for forgiveness, Kim folded his arms across his chest and told his brother that he would go with him, but he looked at him sweatily, not understanding. It got dark outside and a red glow appeared on the horizon. People approached the closed factory. As they got closer, they saw a sign that said, "Guarded area, no entry, only employees allowed." There were 3 people standing there, a man in glasses with his hands folded in his pockets, and 2 girls looking up with open mouths and surprised eyes. Before them was a sight, a rift in the gate, like a huge core swarming with various monsters trying to get out. The man looking at it remarked that it had been 10 years since the last rift. The gate had opened unexpectedly, so the monsters were circling around. The blonde noted that judging by the monsters, disaster was imminent, and the redhead shouted as she jumped up to start the evacuation. The man turned to the girls and confidently assured them that there was no need to rush the evacuation, as his skill was a barrier that restrained the monsters. Growling, one of the monsters jabbed at the barrier, and it stretched slightly. The man continued that the rift has an ES rank, so the strongest monster will be an ES rank. A multitude of monsters began to press into one point of the barrier, and cracks began to appear on it. The man continued that Daja contingency silenced as the barrier broke and creatures came out of it. The girls called out to the leader, shouting. Frowning, the man turned around sharply, the expression of his eyes not visible behind his glasses. The monsters attacked one by one, and the man, without taking his hands out of his pockets, began to fight them off with only his feet, deftly maneuvering between them. The leader continues to confidently fight back alone and decides that BA rank awakened is quite enough for the job. The man remembers himself as a young man, running and excited. Back then he hoped everything would be all right, and someone called out to him, addressing Sir. The guy runs after the man and says that he said as if the group from the department was already there, then it's well the same, addressing respectfully. The man running ahead remarks that the guy is right. After all, the gate rift is releasing S-rank energy, and the higher rank managers shouldn't have a problem. The guy yells out on the run that this is exactly what he's talking about, furrowing his eyebrows and covered in sweat. The man replied that there wouldn't be a problem if it was indeed an AE's rank rift. The guy's eyes rounded. The answer took him aback. Looking around, the man saw many monsters of different kinds of monsters he had killed. Soot flew around the leader. He put his fist to his chin, wondering if something was wrong, because the low-rank monsters were able to break through the barrier. The leader turned around anxiously and gritted his teeth, thinking that it couldn't be that the mana coming out of the gate exceeded his rank. The girls called out to the leader and moved forward closer to the barrier, preparing for battle. New monsters came out of the gate, even stronger than the previous ones. The monsters are breaking the barrier from all sides, trying to make the exit even wider. The cracks are getting bigger and bigger. Now surprised, and the leader looking at the monster, which breaks through the barrier for himself, the girls froze with huge eyes and open mouths. The monster appears from the gate, but the passage is small for him, and he growls furiously, opening his mouth wide and revealing huge teeth. The man stares dumbfounded at the monster with eyes full of terror and asks stammeringly what it is. The barrier crumbles into small pieces and a huge monster emerges from it, roaring wildly, and a bunch of smaller individuals run out in front of it. Surrounded by falling shards from the barrier, the monster roared and flashed its 4 eyes burning. It was a giant rank A ogre. The leader panicked and drenched in sweat. He stares dumbfounded at the monster and realizes that this is not an A rank gate. They are A rank. The man opened his surprised eyes even wider as a pillar of fire flew at him. At a certain distance from each other, explosions began to occur, destroying the floor of the building, fireballs enveloping the entire area. The boy running towards the group shouted to the man running ahead of him what would happen if he was right about the rank of the gate. The boy also asked how the hell he knew about all this while still running. Hyun replied that he had just been through it before. Despite the monsters, the evacuation hadn't even started yet. The man's intuition kicked in, and the guy smilingly asked about what he had heard. Hyun tiredly repeated what his intuition told him was nonsense. Stunned, the young men stopped, and a crowd of panicked and screaming people ran towards them, chased by monsters. People in panic rush with all their legs from the monsters. The girls shouted that they should run because behind them there's a rift of the abyss, and someone called for help. The boy was so amazed that his jaw dropped, sweat flowing in hailstones, and the man asked if he remembered what to do, and it was time to get started. The boy turned around, looked at Hyun in surprise, and asked him what he was going to do then. The man looked forward. The boy looked at the man with wide eyes and heard a strange sound. Hyun staggered confidently forward, forming a stone skin, and said he would deal with the monsters and catch up with the boy, which surprised him even more. There is the tallest building in the city, which is illuminated by floodlights on all sides. Standing at the window, a man with his hair in a ponytail said that the situation was developing quickly. The gate rift was high, and there were no reinforcements. Turning around, a man with a beard and black eyes said that the only possible solution now was an awakened A rank. The bearded man turned to the guy standing behind him, saying that all hope was on him and asking for his help. An Hyun-soo holds the title of a blade of madness. He stands with his eyes burning and tears biting his lower lip. The guy opened his eyes wide, frowned his eyebrows, and asked that everyone leave it to him. He is a hero. He is An Hyun-soo, an awakened A rank goes. There is a battle with monsters outside. A powerful overhead kick lands on one of the monsters, its eyes scattering in different directions. The monster in the guise of a wolf with red eyes is lightning low. A blow of immense force strips it of its fangs. Hyun easily handles the monster. The next one received a stone fist to the chest. The monster falls with a rumble next to the breathless bodies of its kin. The guy gathers fire energy in his hand to strike next. The monsters surrounding him are caught in the vortex of the hunting skill and are destroyed by the fire-spiked vines one by one. Hyun satisfyingly looks at his handiwork. He smiles. His eyes became multicolored and realized that his hunch was correct. The activation of the hunt depends on fatigue. It won't activate if the rate exceeds 70%. The guy gathered the blue light in his hand and thought that most skills used mana, but it wasn't the only thing to worry about. Hyun realized that because of the fatigue that increases when using a skill or exercising, and the higher it is, the harder it is. The guy stands and absorbs the killed monsters. Through this, he replenishes mana, and he is sad that he has to consider so much. Hyun successfully completed the hunt and restored his mana. He smiled widely and thought that the coolest thing was that his rank was upgraded today. The guy smilingly looked around. There were no monsters left in his path. Everyone had turned into his energy, and he was happily shining with one red eye. Hyun noticed that the more often he used hunting, the stronger he became and could quickly become an A rank, or the first SES rank in the world. The boy walked along the ruined sidewalk, looked around, and decided that he was done at this point, and it was time for him to go back to his cousin, who had run away. Hyun's attention was drawn to a sound coming from behind him, and he turned around, looking carefully and questioningly in the direction where the sound was coming from. From the side of the roof, a giant ogre was flying at him from above, knocked down by another red-haired awakened being here. Breaking through the wall of the building, the ogre ended up on the edge of the roof, and above him jumping high and attacked with lightsaber in hand and swearing at the monster. The red-haired man shouted with tears in his eyes that the monster would pay for the deaths of the innocent people, and out justice would punish him. Hyun fell into prostration from what he saw and looked questioningly at his comrade in arms fighting the monster. The ogre manages to get up, growling loudly and angrily. He brings his huge fist over the guy, but the latter moves forward and swings his sword. Fire flashed in Anna's eyes. Holding his sword with both hands, he charged at the monster. With a lightning-fast attack, beams in the form of light crosses flew at the monster and began to wound him, hitting every part of his body. Turning into a pillar of light, An knocked the monster off the roof in the blink of an eye, and it fell to the sidewalk with a thud. Hyun was confused. Standing amidst the wreckage of the building and the dust, he stared with a disbelieving gaze at what was happening. The guy was soaking wet with excitement and thought that the fighter had easily destroyed the A-rank monster. He was the same one who had once single-handedly solved problems. An Hyun-soo's madness blade landed on the destroyed monster, stabbing the monster through with his lightsaber. Hyun thought that the rumors weren't lying about his power, and An swiped his finger at his throat, smilingly winked, and bragged about his victory. An stood on the monster and folded his hands in a gesture of prayer, while Hyun stood on the ground, watching the guy, wondering why he was here. Hyun also thought that before his return, he heard An had a bloody battle with an ogre on the other side of the city. Now he was praying here. Hyun opened his mouth in amazement when An mouthed that the citizens rest in peace. A drop of sweat ran down his cheek, and he opened his mouth. The guy noticed that his inner self had discovered a new skill and he was being electrocuted. He opened his eyes even wider in surprise. Suddenly, a monster appeared from nowhere behind Anna's back and pierced through his chest with a blade, and looks dumbfounded as he holds his arms folded. The guy transfers an uncomprehending look to his offender, coughs, and a clot of blood flies out of his mouth. The monster looks at the guy with burning eyes and says with a satisfied face that An Hyun-soo has finally been caught. There are battles all over the city, sounds echoing throughout the neighborhoods, and the city is covered in dust. The perfect hideout was an atelier in one of the city's shopping centers. The boy drags the blonde girl to the atelier, puts her on the couch, covers her with a found sheet, and waits for her to wake up. The girl has been unconscious for a long time and has not come to her senses. Ji-young frowned and wondered if everything would be all right. He was visibly nervous while waiting. Hyung's words that many would die today flashed through his mind, and fear flashed through his eyes, his pupils dilating. Hyun warned his cousin that one of the dead would be their school nurse, Choi Nayeon, and that puzzled the guy. Hyun also told how Choi would die. She would be focused on first aid, not evacuation, and would be surrounded by monsters. The cousin asked Ji-yeon about his skills. After all, he can put people to sleep using sedation. He should put Choi to sleep and carry her to safety. Ji-yeon looked at his cousin confidently and seriously said he would take care of the rest himself. As he continued to watch over the nurse, Ji-yeon couldn't help but wonder how his cousin knew about everything. Suddenly, the boy opened his eyes wide and started to hesitate. A strange thought visited his head. The boy looked at the sleeping girl and thought that there was no point in saving her just like that, and he had no other explanation. The thoughts in his head started to get confused. The boy raised his head, looked up at the ceiling, and he realized for sure that his brother had a strange skill. Ji-yeon clenched his fist and eventually decided that his brother had awakened with the skill of seeing the future and visualized him with a magic ball in his hands. The guy was suddenly lost and thought that seeing the future was awesome, but then decides it's completely insane. The moon appeared bright and full in the sky, and the guy thought that either way everything would go according to plan. Hyun grunts as the blood spatter flew by his side and watches the fight between the injured Anna and the villain, who injured him intently with a smile on his face. The boy notices that something is not going according to plan. The two continue the battle on the dead giant ogre, the villain more like a projection. And bleeding, covered in sweat and holding his chest, shouts to his opponent who he is and asks him to reveal his identity. The villain disgustedly chuckled and ignored the question and said that the guy was alive despite being stabbed through. The enemy's eyes scattered in different directions, the smile never leaving his face, and he said that a rank is different, but this way the hunt becomes more fun. Awakened that commit crimes are called villains, and in front of them one of them is Hansando with the stealth skill of B rank. This villain is considered a maniac, so he hangs around and kills at his pleasure while the gate is being torn open. Hyun watching the couple from the sidelines, sure enough they hadn't met before. The guy looked at the opponents without taking his eyes off them, and it dawned on him that the future had probably changed because of him. Suddenly Anna's eyes lit up. He swore and gathered strength to punish his enemy. His whole body electrified and veins swelled on his forehead. And finally realized that the villain was in front of him, and he decided to punish him with his own hands and rushed at the enemy with his lightsaber. The guy struck with all his might and his eyes widened with shock. When he heard a laugh, he hit something hard and stone shards flew in different directions. The ground shook under the feet of the opponents, which surprised and frightened them both, and clutched at his sword, and the villain's eyes bulging, trying to keep his balance. There was a wild roar, and the giant ogre rose again, dropping both the guy and the villain, and Hyun tensed up as the pair flew straight at him. The monster roared again, shaking the air, its eyes flashing with righteous anger. An looked down at the ogre and couldn't believe his eyes, for he had defeated him, and the villain was still smiling and chuckling. The villain laughingly added what an incredible regeneration that was expected from an A-rank monster. His arm instantly regenerated. The ogre angrily struck the restored arm at the offending monsters, but they managed to dodge and the fist hit the ground, raising a column of dust. The villain bounced aside and said with a chuckle that there was nothing to be done and would have to leave An Hyuksu to the ogre while he fought him. With a nasty smile and flashing eyes, the villain turned and looked at Hyun. Hyun stood against the villain in the thick of the raised dust. Standing in front of him with his feet wide apart and his hands in his pockets, Han figured they had an audience. The villain laughed with a wild look and licked his blade while saying more casualties. This was just a fairy tale to him. Hyun realized that the villain was about to attack him and looked at him dumbfounded with clenched teeth. The villain picked a new victim and lunged at the guy, swinging his blade and sticking out his tongue, his eyes burning with anger and anticipation. Screaming at the guy to die, he aims the blade at his neck but fails to wound him. Hyun covered his body with stone skin and smiled contentedly. Calling his opponent a moron, the guy powerfully kicks him in the jaw, never reaching his hands and pockets. Finally, the smile slid off the villain's face. Coughing and swearing, the villain averted his fall by breaking with his feet and realized that Hyun was awakened, not a shred of fun left in him. Hyun addressed his opponent by name and he looked at the guy listening, clutching his blade tighter and glaring caustically. The guy fixed his sleeve, walked towards the villain and said that the psycho who was obsessed with killing and using stealth skill was now in front of him. Hyun added with a full-mouthed smile that he was happy to see them and began to cover his hand with the stone, looking at his opponent with his eyes fixed on him. The guy quickly strikes with his stone fist, and the villain lightning fast thrusts his blade forward and fends off the attack. The villain smiles again, jumps up, turns his blades around and tries to strike forward. The guy instantly folds his arms covered in stone on his chest in a cross to protect himself from the blow. After hitting the stone, a deep crack appears on the villain's blade. The guy's arm quickly moves forward after counterattacking without obvious damage. Countless times they strike each other, and finally the villain manages to damage the guy. The guy grits his teeth in surprise. The guy managed to fight back, and the villain rustled his soles and left a mark on the ground and said that the guy had enough skills. Hyun quickly recovered and heard that the bleeding skill is useless against him. That's why he feels so confident. As the fight between the A rankers continues, the villain remarked that the guy must think he can win since the skills aren't effective against him. The guy clenched his fists and raised them in front of him, looking at his opponent carefully. Raising his blade, Han said that the guy needed to realize that the world would not dance to his tune and gave him a furious look. The enemy instantly vanished with a silent sound, using the stealth skill. The guy was alert and ducked carefully, studying the space. He realized the essence of the enemy's skill. He becomes invisible. Hyun felt that the enemy attacked and directed his gaze to where the next attack would come from. The guy sharply put out his hand, but it's useless because the enemy disappears again. The enemy with a smile appears from behind, which scared and surprised the guy because he does not have time to turn around. Having turned slightly, the guy puts one hand in front of him and manages to defend himself from the blow of the blade. After this attack, the guy is dumbfounded because this time blood came out of his stone hand, and his opponent laughed snidely. The villain swung his blade, chuckled gloatingly, and asked if the lad knew how many such weaklings he had hunted. Han spun around Hyun with lightning speed, delivering a succession of blade strikes while telling him that he had outlasted all those who had deluded themselves that they were invincible. The guy receives blow after blow, straining to listen to his opponent, and notices that his stone skin is beginning to crumble, and he wishes him dead. At great speed, the villain delivers a controlling blow and knocks Hyun down, his eyes burning, and he said that many skills have flaws. From the powerful blow, the blood belonging to the guy splatters on the sidewalk. Hyun stands with his head down and breathing heavily. He was seriously injured, and a vapor has gone from his body. The guy raised his eyes and looked at his opponent, still standing with his arms crossed in a protective stance, and thought that he didn't know about the flaw of the stone skin. It became clear to Hyun that the skill does not completely block attacks. A sharp blow can shatter the stone, and the broken part will be replaced by a less durable growth. The villain is an experienced fighter, and destroying the guy's armor was his goal from the beginning. He found the weak point of the skill and continues to search, looking with wild eyes. The guy looked at the enemy with a confident look and smiled widely. He realized that hand-to-hand doubles even against a BE-ranked opponent. Hyun realized that his capabilities were far from B rank and said that he should stop experimenting, which dumbfounded the enemy. His jaw dropped. The opponent rushed at the guy with an instantaneous jerk, kicking up dust under his feet, but he stood with his arms at his sides and relaxed. Hyun turns to the BAE-ranked villain Han Sando and asks if he knows why the guy wanted to meet him, the villain continuing to carry on laughing. After asking what kind of nonsense the guy is talking about, the eyes of the opponent widened to the extreme. The guy standing with a smile and an outstretched hand with threads, he told the enemy that he wanted to take away his skill, which put the enemy in a stupor. The shadow of the guy's palm, Han was speechless, thinking what the hell is this terrifying mana, and how could he hide it all this time? The villain came to his senses and chuckled gloatingly. A plan matured in his head. He released energy all over his body, and blood splattered around him. Laughing, the villain called the guy an idiot and said he didn't care what the skill was, disappeared and swirled around the guy again. Han's sure the guy can't unseeably hit him, but Hyun gathered his nits in his fist and reminded him what the guy said about weaknesses in any skill. The guy realized this after killing some monsters. Among those monsters, countless had eluded him. By activating the hunting skill, putas would appear and suck on the monsters, and at the very end, the hunt would devour them all. Simply put, no matter where the villain hides, his spiky vines will find him, and the enemy makes sure of it in the shock of the threads reaching for him. The villain half looks at the entanglements and doesn't realize what's going on. No matter where he runs to, they're chasing him. The smile has fallen off his face. The guy's one eye has changed color to red, and he stares at his opponent with confidence and ruthlessness. The enemy opened his eyes in horror and screamed loudly, and the guy muttered that the hunt would consume the enemy anyway. Hyun, surrounded by his black energy, smiling contentedly and victoriously, he stretches one arm out to the side and clutches the bindings. The battle has lasted all night, and the sun begins to rise over the city. The battlefield is all destroyed, and in a stone-free area lies a rank awakened. The boy lies exhausted and thinks that if that fucking villain hadn't impaled him, he would have won. An lifts his head, his face covered in blood, and he thinks that the hero of justice, the invisible warrior, even he, An Hyun-soo, can't escape death. The guy's strength has finally left him, and he can't even move, and a giant ogre comes roaring at him. The battle isn't over. The monster roared loudly, opened its jaws, and raised its fist over his head. The ogre is covered in terrifying energy and slammed his fist into the ground. Rocks flew in different directions and dust rose up. Growling and peering at the ground with 4 burning eyes, the ogre leans down with its maw open. When the dust settled, there was no one in the hole that was formed after the monster hit, and the monster stood up surprised. Hyun shouted loudly to the monster, "What the hell?" After all, he was lying on the ground. The ogre angrily turned around and looked towards the guy holding Anna by the scruff of the neck. He used the concealment skill and saved him from being killed. The guy stands smiling with multicolored eyes and looks at the monster and thought about the power. It looks handy right now. The man who opened the door opened his mouth in amazement and froze on the threshold, and the woman behind him pressed her hands to her lips in a daze. Ji-young stands laughing and putting his hands behind his head, while Hyung stands behind him with his hands in his pockets and smilingly asks his uncle if they're okay. Tears of joy came to the eyes of the uncle and aunt. They didn't expect the children alive anymore. They thought the monsters had gotten to them. Going home, the boy laughed again and said that everything was fine and asked Hyun to give in. The uncle said that everything was fine for Ji-young, but their house was destroyed, as if a gang of thieves had been here. And the boy laughed again, because it wasn't that bad. The city was finally quiet, not a soul on the deserted streets. Hyun took out his phone and looked at the screen. The anchor was broadcasting the breaking news. The reporter said that according to the government's decree, the danger of the rift has hardly been completely eliminated as of this minute. The government has ordered the closure of nearby schools for a week due to the possibility of another rupture. As news of survivors emerges, the public is slowly calming down. The band leader is outraged. He has mixed up the ranks now in the hospital. A shocked nurse tells police that when she came to her senses, she was already in that atelier. She was mistaken for a criminal. Journalists surrounded Anna, and he waved them away with tears in his eyes, saying that he was not the hero who defeated the giant ogre, but someone else. However, the corpse of the ogre has not yet been examined, and the identity of the villain who attacked the citizens is not yet known. The people are still worried, and the fighters are studying the area. One of the men is also watching the news on his phone, smiling contentedly and saying that everything is fine. Hyun, watching the news, disconnected his phone and smiled, thinking it was good since he wasn't mentioned, and stopped at the sleepers. The guy smiled even wider and looked ahead. He decided that in that case, it was time to move on to the next level. Hyun followed the tracks to the tunnel. The cracks in the entrance let him know that it was pretty old. The guy now had 3 skills. Stealth is a worthy reward, but with the guy's current level, it's hard for him to use 3 skills at once, and he imagined how he would be overwhelmed by monsters. Hyun thought that recklessly using his skills could deplete his mana a lot, thus increasing his fatigue, which could be a fatal mistake. The guy decided that the best way to avoid depletion was to use potions that restored mana and reduced fatigue. Hyun noted that the potions were quite expensive, so he had to hunt to earn them and went into the ruined tunnel, holding on to one of the walls with his hand. He saw a crack in the wall where the light was oozing out and climbed into it. He needed to get permission to hunt, because he couldn't use his skills any other way. Hyun feels the wall and moves further into the crack, thinking that he has only one way out, walking through uncharted dungeons. The guy reaches the end of the crack and comes out a spacious dungeon, where he is greeted by a darkness of spider monsters of different ranks. One spider raised a surprised hand and said, "How dare a mortal come here?" A second asked how he found them, and a third offered to eat him. The guy was surprised at what the monsters were saying and asked them how high their intelligence was. He got the BAE rank spider sisters. Hyun confidently said, looking at the sisters, "Bay rank would not be enough to raise his level. He would have to devour hundreds of their kind." The sisters grinned, their eyes flashed, and they lashed out at the guy, because how dare he talk to them like that? Didn't he realize the situation he was in? One of the sisters puffed up her cheeks and prepared to attack, continuing to move towards the guy. The spider women shouted that they would eat him alive, and the 3 of them let loose a tangle of their web at him, and the guy didn't even budge, keeping his hands in his pockets. Laughing with glee, one of them snidely asked if he felt the ability to move leave his body, and he became paralyzed. The guy was surrounded by his thorn vines again. One of his eyes changed color and he smiled smugly, for his resistance had been increased. The spiderlings recoiled in horror and opened their mouths in surprise, and the guy said what he assumed: they have pretty useful skills. There was a whisper from the tunnel for the guy to stop, and then there were screams. The guy had successfully completed the hunt and gotten the paralysis skill. There is a building towering in the city. It is the New South Korea Players Association. The gate of the building is guarded around the clock, and the door is locked with an ancient lock. In the room sit 3 people at a large table, a girl drinking tea, a man thinking about something holding his chin, and one sitting at the head of the table. The deputy human resources manager Go Taeyuk is visibly nervous. because in front of him are two of the best players from the association. A player is an awakened one who has official permission to use skills for various purposes such as research and sweeps. At the moment, there are 5 game centers of the association, and in them are the likes of Anne, Go, and the group leader. And there are also 4 strongest guilds. The first great guild, the invincible fighters who specialize in physical power. The second great guild, the creator alchemists, who create potions and weapons. The third great guild, the magicians or wizards who harness the power of nature. The fourth great guild, the informers or vagabonds. They secretly obtain any information. And the registered organization that governs the players, and includes the 4 great guilds, is the Players' Association. The man frowned his eyebrows and kept his eyes on those present. For now, the strongest were sitting in front of him. A girl with a strong aura greeted the chairman and said smilingly that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. She was a master of the S-ranked Rogue Guild. The chairman thanked the girl for coming, although she is a busy lady. He is an S-ranked player and his aura is as strong as the girl's. The chairman asked the girl if they recognized something, and she interjected if it was about the Villains Guild and looked straight in front of her. The Villains Guild, a criminal organization formed by the craziest criminals. They wear rings with 3 skulls. The girl put some sheets on the table and said, "Here are the recent actions of the villains and a list of the spotted members." The man sighed. Yua Young is sure that Chejin-Wei wouldn't have called her just to hand over the papers, so something is up and she asked about it smilingly. The chairman laughed and replied that she herself knew what it was, holding the report of the enemy guild in her hands. The girl was surprised and pulled her lips into a tube. When she heard the man wanted her opinion, she repeated his words. Sitting across from her, the man asked when Ah Young was tested. She was surprised but replied that at the age of 19. The girl looked at the chairman carefully, waiting for the discussion to continue. It dawned on the girl and she mumbled something about not being told. And the man smiled at her surprise and asked her what she thought. Can a high school kid defeat a monster? One of those now sitting on a mountain of destroyed monsters in the dungeon. The guy stuffs a backpack full of magic stones, picks up the phone and calls one of the great guilds to the alchemists. Hyung, all frazzled, continues to pull stones out of slain monsters and tells the phone that he's calling to buy potions from them. The order to close the school for a week due to the gate breaking is over, and the crowd of students are heading to class. The guy thinks about what he's been doing these past 7 days, pairing up with his cousin to do physical training. During the week, Hyun cleared a couple of dungeons, fighting different monsters to collect as many magic stones as possible. Finally, the guy came to one of the great alchemist guilds and brought them the stones, to which they were very surprised, saying how much mana stones are. The stunned guild experts opened their mouths and stammered and said that he would become their super VIP and asked to buy from them more often. The guy sits with his chin resting on his chin, thinking that he still has a long way to go, even though he's leveled up and bought potions. Hyun sits at his desk in class, thinking about how he still has to go to school, and doesn't notice 3 people entering the classroom and looking at him. One of the entered questioningly said in Hyun, and the other said that there is a rumor that he beat up Bahyuksu's 6s. All 3 of them are nervous. The guys asked if he was really awakened, and one of them remarked with horror on his face that either way Hyun was screwed. The others started asking why. The classmate replied that it could only mean one thing, having said that footsteps were heard in the hallway, a small group of people approaching the classroom. The boy stared blankly at his classmates without turning his head or removing his hand from his chin. The class became noisy. Desks and chairs flew, knocking each other down. 2 big men in white shirts came in with serious faces and blank stares. Suddenly, someone's foot quickly landed on the desk with a thud. A smiling guy sat down in front of Hyun and threw his legs over his desk. Hyun realizes that Lee Chang-jae will not leave the situation unresolved. With a cocky and confident smile, Lee said that they haven't seen each other for a long time and called Hyun a friend. He has a powerful aura about him because he is an S rank. Lee is the 3rd generation of the Teason group. His father sponsors the high school, and he is the head of the school's bullies. Hyung recalls how he was beating him up, and from one punch, he flew back against the wall and couldn't answer his opponent. The guy looks at his opponent with anger and wipes the blood on his face with the back of his palm. Bullies never go one at a time. They attack in groups and bully the weak, humiliating and laughing at them. The main villain who ordered Bahyuksu to bully Hyun just because he hasn't awakened, and now he's watching with a satisfied smirk. Without raising his eyes, Hyung replied that he was never going to be friends with Lee and laughed unhappily. The guy reprimanded, raised his head, told Lee to shut up and get lost, his own powerful aura enveloping him and looking convincing. Lee became enraged and started yelling at Hyun, calling him names and pointing his finger. Lee himself looked at the guy with indifference. Lee asked Hyun if he was thinking about what he was chalking up. Suddenly, the guy behind Lee gets a fist in his face and hits him hard. The head of the bullies personally stood up, punched his henchman and asked with a smile if he couldn't see that the boss was talking to Hyun, and the guy fell to the floor. Hyun didn't even move. He just sits there with his hands folded in his pockets and silently watching, Lee addressing him by name. The head said he knows why the guy is in a good mood after defeating Ba Hyuksu and started getting irritated, letting out energy through his body. The guy looked at Lee with wide-open eyes filled with terror, a fever blasting him. The head with a sinister smile loomed over him, and the guy involuntarily recoiled back as a fireball appeared above his opponent's head. Hyun's confusion quickly passed, and he too was covered in his energy. Smiling, he thought, "This is the magic of an AE's rank awakened. Really amazing." The guy broke into a sweat when Lee said he better come to his senses while he was being lenient, but the guy had his own plans. He had something stashed in his pocket. Hyun takes out his hand. It's all burning and covered in familiar threads, and he wonders what will happen if the enemy faces the hunt. A girl enters the classroom. She too has an energy aura and asks Lee to stop. One of Lee's gang tries to stop the girl, but she, without looking at him, grabs his hands, freezing her. The guy screamed in surprise. Hyun knows her. It was Im Ah-yoon who walked in, which surprised the guy, and she asked both the rivals to calm down, looking at them with her icy eyes. The guy smiled cheekily and furrowed his eyebrows, a drop of sweat running down his cheek. Im Ah-yoon, class president, young lady from a wealthy family, half-sister of Yoo Ah-young, awakened AE's rank, aspiring model. The girl is a candidate for first place next semester. She has a noble debt on the future SS rank player, has countless nicknames. In the future, the girl will get even more nicknames, but the problem is that she is too stubborn. She finally smoothly lowered her hand. Ah-yoon stood in front of Lee and clenched her fist tightly, looking straight into his eyes. He doesn't back down just like that. The guy in return looked at her calmly, keeping his hands in his pockets. Lee laughed sweetly, covering his eyes. He made a good-natured face and asked what it meant to stop. They might be misunderstood. After all, he was just socializing with his friend. The girl hesitated, still looking at Lee, confident, calm, and asked if he was socializing with a friend. Do their friends get punched in the face? Lee's eyes lit up. A shadow slipped on his face, and he warns Ah-yoon to watch his tongue. He still continues to smile. The girl confidently states, without blinking an eye, that she'll have to use force if Lee doesn't leave on his own, ordering him to stop and get out. Hyun sits with a confused face looking at Lee, and Ah-yoon noticed the tension hanging in the class. If they don't cool down, there will be nothing left of the class. Lee cocked his head to the top and disdainfully looked at the girl with burning eyes. The smile slid off his face. The girl began to stare back confidently into her opponent's eyes and opened her eyes even wider. Lee smilingly turned around and waved a finger in the air, agreeing to finish and saying that he had no need to fight Hyun. Suddenly, Lee's hand flares up and he wondered if that's what the girl wanted to hear. She turned her head and looked at the flaming hand. The guy turned around again, gathered a fireball in his hand, and smiling swung it at the girl. She didn't move, only raised her hand. Lee, holding the fireball in his hand and scattering, abruptly stops, frozen and bulging eyes. He is shocked that he lost his temper on the school grounds. The girl who was about to counterattack also stopped, stunned, and looked away. These two were stopped by the bell, announcing the start of class. Another bell rings, and Hyun sits quietly on the sidelines, watching the couple carefully. From a speaker hanging on the wall came the announcement from the radio broadcasting club. The information is carried everywhere. The guys look at the speaker in surprise. A special lecture with the Players Association has been organized in the main hall. All students need to report to the main hall immediately, and the voice from the speaker repeated the information again. The fire in Lee's hands slowly began to die down. He looked at the speaker in surprise and asked again about the Players Association. The guy furrowed his eyebrows in thought and looked seriously straight in front of him. The girl standing and holding her hands as if ready to fight back at any time, her eyes glittering even brighter, not a single muscle trembling on her face. Lee smiled again and leaned forward slightly, uttering a sweet word of gosh. Leaving, Lee gave Hyun one last throw that he was just lucky. Lingering at the door, the two guys headed out with angry expressions on their faces. The girl didn't change her stance or facial expression and silently followed them until the door slammed shut behind them. And Yoon turned her head to Hyun and worriedly asked if he was okay. The glint in her eyes faded, but she didn't lower her hands. The girl said she was fine and didn't need to thank her, but when she turned around, she saw that the chair the guy was sitting on was empty. And Yoon was so immersed in defense that she didn't notice how Hyun rushed past her and asked at the door why she froze. It's time for the gathering. The girl gave the guy a surprised and questioning look, and he added that since she wasn't going, he was going first. The door closed with a bang. The girl opened her mouth in amazement and opened her eyes wide. She wondered if Hyun had always been so confident. The main hall, where all the students were invited, was a separate building on the school grounds. The students gathered in the hall were buzzing, all of them asking what the Players Association lecture was about and whether it was related to the Rift Gate. The students looked at the stage in surprise as Go Taehook, the deputy personnel manager of the Players Association, stammered a greeting and introduced himself. The man is standing in the center of the stage with two hands leaning on the podium and surrounded by security guards. He said that he came for two reasons. The first reason was to apologize and give a safety briefing. Covered in a magical aura, he began to speak about the second reason. The manager took up the microphone. His eyes flashed and he announced with a satisfied look that there would be changes to the player rank selection. Lee, standing in the front row and keeping his hands in his pockets, angrily tisked and scolded Hyun. And Yoon also thought about Hyun, pressing her fist to her lips and lowering her gaze. She thought she needed to have a word with him. Hyun listened to the manager and yawned with his hand covering his mouth and opened his mouth wide. The room started talking about the selection of players, how it relates to students, isn't the minimum age 19 years old, and that this year they will fly through. The manager continues, answering questions that they may think so and so, but they are here because it applies to apprentices now. The man said that there has been an increase in dungeons and monsters due to the recent gate rift. Guo added that the Players Association had come to the conclusion that they were short of people, so they were opening the doors to high school students. All the kids standing in the audience were stunned and couldn't believe their ears, asking if they had heard correctly and if they could participate. The man said that each school selects candidates based on their skills, personal scores, grades, and behavior. Hen smiled at this lie. As the manager continues talking, the guy thought that high school students would really be allowed to participate in these selections, but the selection has already started. The manager gazes intently into the hall, and thinking that his Tuka skill would help him, his eyes blazed with purple flames. A core with many eyes appeared above the students unseen by them and scans each one. It is the eye of the observer. Each student is assigned a number. The observer's eye is able to quantify the overall capabilities of the object, and if you focus, you can see the target's status window. The man standing behind the podium smiles and continues to answer questions from the high school students. The manager looked around the gym and thinks the numbers here are much better than elsewhere. They would make great players. The man gets nervous and thinks he is shocked by the two men in this hall. He looks at them stunned. Lee is standing with his hands folded in his pockets, surrounded by flames, his eyes burning, and the score is 1,924. And Yun folded her arms on her chest and confidently looks forward. She is surrounded by ice shards, and the index is 2,335. The man thought tiredly. The vagabonds were only sending him a list of possible candidates because the chairman asked. The manager smiled contentedly, but he can't believe there are so many awakened people here. He needs to write letters of recommendation when he gets back. Suddenly, Lee raises his hand up, smiling, and addressed the man as Mr. Player. Then he shocked the surrounding students. The man looks questioningly into the audience and looks at the guy intently. Lee continues that the manager said he would inform them of the selection process for the players, but are some of the people present suitable? The man asked what he meant, and the guy smilingly lowered his hand and replied that only the awakened ones should be at the selection. Lee looked slyly at Hyung, letting him know he was talking about him, and added that there was no point in non-awakened people listening to this lecture. The guy said that strength isn't all that makes a person a player. It's the rank of awakening, knowledge of the abyss, and the ability to think in different situations that matter. Lee added that to be a player, one must have all kinds of characteristics in all areas, so as not to get hurt or let others down. The boy smilingly pointed out that all of these things were only of value to the awakened in the end. All the high school students turned their heads at Hyung with laughter, and one girl said that for the unawakened, the manager was just pouring salt on the wound. Hyung, unhappy with what was going on, looked angrily at Lee and wondered if he was going to go that far to see if Hyung had awakened. Lee realized what the guy was thinking and grinned contentedly, thinking that if he was awakened, let him prove it. And Yoon, who was standing in the front rows, couldn't stand it and irritatedly turned to Lee Changja. He didn't even look at her, continuing to smile at Hyun. The girl imagined Hyun's reaction and she broke into a sweat. She thought that he would be rude to her if she wanted to help him because he didn't ask for it. And Yoon abruptly turned around, clenched her teeth and closed her eyes, thinking that she didn't care and didn't give a damn. With her behavior, she puzzled the surrounding students. Lee didn't stop saying that he hoped the manager would let the unfit ones go as soon as possible. The man replied that it was up to the students to stay or not. The guy smilingly turned to Hyun and asked if he's not bothered by this, since he might be chosen since he still hasn't awakened. Lee continues to pester the guy, asking if he doesn't even care about these selections. Hyun doesn't react in any way, silently looking at Lee. Hyung smiled with the corners of his lips looking at Lee and thought that he was trying to get him out of it. But without proving awakening, you can't sign up for the sectionals. The guy smiled smugly after all. You don't need to prove anything to get a letter of recommendation. He was scanned by the manager with his eye. The manager looked around the hall again. Now he singled out 3 students out of all the guys. The man thought about Lee. He's an awakened AE's rank, but he's bullying others, and it's unfortunate. Looking at Hyun, the man noted that according to the student department, he is not awakened and has no rank. The manager scanning the guy saw his red aura but couldn't view the information. It's not available. A miserable existence among the awakened. The man suddenly recoiled. He was stunned by what he saw. Hyun turned to Lee, which surprised him very much. He agreed that he was wrong. It was a very rash act on his part. The guy continues that if a pathetic, unawakened person attends such a lecture, it will hurt his pride, which embarrassed Lee even more. Hyun pretends to be upset and his face takes on a pained expression. Instantly, the guy's face changes. He smiles cheekily, shows his middle finger and says he's out of here. Lee looking at the guy is all shaken up even though he is smiling. His eyebrows arched, leaving a few dents on his forehead, and the guy told them to stay and listen to the lecture. The man standing on the stage is dumbfounded because his observer's eye didn't work. The manager was amazed because even the chairman could read with his rank. Go Tae-hook thought that the observer's eye didn't fail with the tramp either. What happened to the guy? This has never happened before. Hyun walks towards the exit with his head down and his hands in his pockets. Lee sees him off in bewilderment, and the others look back at him shocked. The manager keeps his dumbfounded gaze on the departing Hyun and doesn't understand what happened to his skill and how the guy is different from the others. Hyun slowly walks away with the high school students murmuring behind him. Until the very end, the manager tries to read information from the guy, but it's not available to him. In the case of him, his skill is useless. Before he disappears from sight, the guy turns around and smiles slightly. He allows himself to be scanned. The information became available, and the man read it dumbfounded. Sweat broke out on his face, and his eyes widened to an unbelievable size. The guy has a red aura. He stands in a half-turn and smiles. One eye of his is on fire, and a king appeared behind his shoulders. More figures, over 5,000. Yoon came to an unsociable library. On the shelves are rows of books. The guy took a lot of books and sits right on them. Sighing, he said that apparently he will spend his whole life to find clues about the king. The shadow of the 3 appeared at the entrance. Hyun looked at the entrance with a smile and put off reading. The guy, and said that it looked like he wouldn't find anything useful here, and turned his attention to the people who had come in. They were the guys he had once beaten up. The guys looked at Hyun proudly, and one said that Chang Jae was looking for him and ordered him to follow them. The guy continued leafing through the book and smilingly asked what would happen if he refused. The bully with the band-aid on his nose immediately smiled and snidely asked about his aunt who kept a restaurant. Hyun covered himself with his book, rounded his eyes, looked questioningly at the guys, and pretended to be scared shitless. Hyun looked surprised and the guy questioned and the guy replied. That's what Chang Jae asked him to tell him. The guy called Hyun a lowly orphan, and all 3 of them laughed and asked if he wanted to cause trouble for his aunt when he was already suffering. The bully covered his eyes, covered in a blue aura, and told Hyun not to worry, they'll get him to the leader. Suddenly the door breaks under the pressure of the sand, glass and splinters flying in different directions. Dust has risen in the library, all the shelves are destroyed and books are scattered. The guy with the band-aid is coughing, he has his mouth wide open and his throat is clutched by a hand, making the veins on his neck and chin swell. Just a moment later, Hyun straightened up the 2 6 men. They unconsciously lying on the floor and holding one by the throat lifted him above him with one hand. Continuing to hold the guy's weight, he angrily told him not to make him repeat himself twice and asked where their leader was. Hyun came to the assembly hall where the meeting with the manager had been held some time ago and the grandstand was already empty. This place is part gymnasium and there is a basket of balls in the corner. Hyun sees Lee at the end of the gym and he's not standing there alone but with a guard. The guard stretched his arm forward and let out a stream of energy and mouthed that the guy present was surprising. Lee smilingly asked him what he thought of Hyun. The bodyguard said that after this guy came in here, he activated a couple status-revealing skills and keeps reading. The man explained that the skills don't work on the guy with such a great resistance. Maybe he's A-ranked and the guy is clothed with a red aura. Lee smiled contentedly and said that just as he thought, Hyun has awakened and suggests the guard talk to their friend. Hyun is angry but doesn't show it. He stands silent and stares calmly ahead. Lee steps forward and says that he has no purpose to hurt Hyun and really just wanted to test him. Chang Jae holds out his hand and explains that he wants to start his own guild after taking his father's place. But even a genius like him can't do everything on his own. Lee wondered if Hyun had a clue what he was talking about, but the guy stood with a blank expression on his face, and continued to remain silent. The redhead widened his eyes, raised one finger up and added that talented people, not someone like Bahyuk-suk, but real talents need him. Lee put his hand out and pointed his finger at the guy and said that he needs someone like him, the current Kim Tae-hyun. The leader raised his hands, tilted his head, and like an evil genius mouthed for Hyun to forget old grudges and start working for him. With greedy eyes and a face full of anticipation, Lee said that Hyun would be rich and honored. He would even pull his family out of the poverty they were living in. Hyun interrupted Lee, saying he was talking too much, and he froze with his hands up, looking at the guy questioningly and surprised. Hyun repeated Lee's words of verification, wealth and honor, addressing him by name. Hyun was beyond angry and told Lee that he had crossed the line. His body poured stone, and he put his hand out in front of him, glaring angrily at his opponent. Lee's eyes widened involuntarily and he was at a loss for words, the smile sliding off his face when he saw Hyun's transformation. Having guessed something, Lee exhaled with a smile, covered his eyes and lowered his head slightly. The bully gathered fire in his hand and covered himself in fire energy, saying that he had forgotten about the fact that the Sinjis needed to be tamed, his eyes turning red. Putting both hands on the floor, the man summoned a magic seal that glowed as it appeared. The bodyguard used the room skill, and a barrier began to form throughout the space. The guard finished saying after looking at his master that now no one outside would be able to know about the young master's fight, and shook off his hands. The man said that now they would enjoy the performance. Lee took off with a burst of fire, and Hyun dodged and jumped to the top. Hyun gritted his teeth and furrowed his eyebrows with wild eyes looking at his opponent. He swung his stone fist and flew at his enemy from above. Lee gathered flames in his hand and swung, looking at his opponent with eyes full of anger and attacking with a satisfied look. The guys rushed at each other with incredible power, and as their fists struck, a huge fireball covered in dust formed between them. The two fists of stone and fire met with crushing force. The hall rumbled and pieces of stone began to fly from Hyun's hand. The boy recoiled in pain, his stone skin cracking as he clenched his teeth and squinted one eye. Hyun flew down and breaks his foot. Lee's attack came as a surprise to him. He hits full force and attacks from above, covering his leg with fire. Lee swings at his opponent, and he flies away, and a wall of fire appears in front of him like a thick cloud. The flame-covered hen throws his head back and coughs up a blood clot. Lee, with a frantic face, continues his attack and wonders if Hyun has finally realized his place now. The bodyguard stands back with his hands in his pockets and watches as fireballs erupt all over the hall and sounds come from them. The guard doesn't get hit by the fire, but the airwaves come from him and drive him away, and he looks at the fight and thinks he feels sorry for Hyun. Hyun bursts through the flames with a scream and attacks Lee, and the guard decides that the guy has a high-level defense skill, an A rank. The bodyguard smiles, thinking it's probably hard for Hyun to find a worthy opponent with fighting skills and mental strength. The guy attacks Lee and is surprised, and the guy easily fights back with burning eyes and a smug smile on his face. Lee looks at his opponent with a smug look and thrusts his hand forward, which glowed brightly. The redhead uses the Majesty Incarnate skill with impressive power, hits the guy in the shoulder, and a wave of fire passes through him. Hyun back up again. The man watches carefully from the side and thinks that Hyun doesn't stand a chance of winning. He'd better realize his place sooner and give up. The bodyguard is pierced by a thought, and he rounds his eyes, looking at his opponent surprised and questioning. Lee came at Hyun mercilessly, delivering blow after blow, forcing him to retreat backward, the loud sounds of blows being heard. Suddenly, Hyun stopped, leaned slightly, and took his torso to the side, which made Lee miss. The opponent switched roles, and now the guy is throwing a series of punches, while Lee is backing up and covering his hands to defend himself. The opponents finally try again at the same time in lightning fast and direct their fists to strike each other with lightning speed. Lee misses a punch and Hyun hits him in the face with all his strength, blood splattering along the guy's arm. The blow was so powerful that Lee flew backwards and kicked up a cloud of dust that hit him completely, while Hyun froze with his arm outstretched and his legs spread wide. The bodyguard crouched down in surprise and covered in sweat. He pulled his hands out of his pockets and whispered in surprise that such a thing was impossible. His master had been overpowered. Lee lay coughing on the broken floor, beaten and unable to get up, breathing heavily. The guy opened his mouth wide, his energy brightened, and he shouted to Hyun, cursing in a mat, "What has he done to him? His body, he can't move." The bodyguard is discouraged by the outcome of the fight and is surprised that the young master is immobilized, and what the hell did he do? Hyun stands confidently on his feet, continuing to clench his fists, and the guard wonders if reinforcement isn't his only skill and who he is. The guy continues to clench his fist standing in the raised dust and smiles happily, saying that it finally worked. Hyun got 3 skills constantly fighting with someone. The stone skin he got in the fight with Hyuk when he defeated him. The second skill, stealth, he got in a fight with a villain who attacked the guy during the break in the gate. The third skill, paralysis, he got when he defeated the 3 spider sisters in the dungeon alone. From the beginning, Dae-hyun doesn't use all 3 skills, but C-rank paralysis has a hard time breaking through S-rank resistance, and in the battle he tried to hit. During the fire attack, Dae-hyun used stealth, but it immediately disappears under the influence of fire. Using the hunting putas, they hit the enemy's resistance and passed on. Paralysis is the last option, but it's not easy to apply. Dae-hyun planned ahead to paralyze the opponent in close combat, and he succeeded. Skills that affect stats work more favorably at close range than at long range. The same thing if you hit endlessly with paralysis, the S rank will crack. The guy hits until the resistance of the S rank cracks. The last hit was fatal for the enemy, and he finally falls down. Lee lies motionless on the ruined floor, and Hyun takes a few steps forward, dust billowing around the opponents across the hall. The bodyguard stands there with his mouth hanging open in surprise, unable to move and come to the aid of his young master. The man covered in sweat was stunned and thought that the guy was a genius. In a one-on-one battle, he surpassed the young master. The boy moved closer to his opponent and looked down at him. Lee gave a fake laugh, no smile on his face, and he said as he acknowledged Hyun. The redhead admitted that he underestimated the guy too much, because he just couldn't lose to a sucker like him, and pulled out a shard with a trembling hand. The bully struggled to lift his hand and looked at the glittering stone clutched between his fingers. Lee squeezed his fingers and broke the stone. It shattered into small shards and energy was pulled from it. The scattered shards fly in front of Hyun's eyes, and he looked at his opponent in surprise with his mouth open and eyes widening. The redhead slowly stood up and a huge skeleton pierced with fire appeared above his head, and the guy stood as if he was standing on the ground. Lee began to reincarnate. His arm and part of his head went up in flames. He grinned gloatingly and said that from now on, he would fight at full strength. Hyun quickly turned around and ran away from the monster, who let loose a fireball at him, under which the floor cracked. The guy runs as fast as he can from the monster's attack, who swings a fist full of flames at Hyun. Kim Tae-hyun jumps up so sharply that the airwave picks up the shards of glass scattered on the floor behind him. The monster is huge and the guy is outmatched in speed, so he deftly dodges the blow, jumps up and builds up a big stone fist. The guy looks at the monster carefully. Taking aim, he swings his fist. The monster opens its mouth and exhales a huge cloud of fire whistling into a ball. The guy does not let the monster to complete the attack and hits the very center of the fireball. The monster tensed up more and more, fanning the flames. Plunging into the fireball, the stone skin began to steam and small pebbles began to fly off his hand. Pushing his hand deeper and deeper into the fire, the stones began to fly off faster, exposing the guy's skin. There is an explosion in the monster's head area, and the guy with burnt hands flies down. The guy crashes down on his back from the high ground and coughs, continuing to furrow the floor with his back. The bully stands and watches Hyun, who finds the strength to get up, and the guard thought that this was the true appearance of Mr. Heartflame's skill. The man stepped back to a safe distance and became nervous. After all, it's usually difficult to unleash the full power of the Lord since he's S-ranked. However, just now, the Lord had just used a strength-enhancing stone. It is obtained by refining the mana stone that is the core of monsters. This stone temporarily increases mana, resistance, and physical strength. Now the young master will be able to fully unleash his AE's rank power using the stone. He put his hand forward and the monster roared. The bodyguard panicked. He kept his gaze on his master. He knows that there are downsides to using the stone. The guard shouted to the master that he should stop now and asked if he was going to kill the enemy. The man does not stop shouting that such power is still beyond the master. His blood will literally boil from the overabundance of mana. Not listening to the bodyguard, Lee still launches a fire spear at the enemy. The spear hits the place where the bodyguard is standing and explodes, and he's thrown back by the shockwave. Lee stopped controlling himself, ordering the guard to be silent, said not to dare to tell him one of his eyes burns, and lightning leaps from the other. Covered in fire, Lee himself took on the appearance of a fiery skeleton and extended his hand forward, saying that he couldn't let things go down now. The wounded Hyun coughs with difficulty to get up and stunned looks at the redhead. He clenches his fists, listening to his opponent. The enraged monster strikes at Hyun. An explosion erupts and the guy is blown backwards by the blast wave, rocks and glass shards flying everywhere. Lee laughed hysterically. He longs for his opponent's death and orders him to die, glaring with his eyes. The bodyguard abruptly tears towards his master and thought that things are bad. He seems to have lost control of himself, and how is he going to deal with the consequences? The man, after jumping, lands near a hole in the floor from which smoke is billowing and shouts to Hen if he is alive and asks him to surrender and get the hell out of here. The guard reaches the edge of the broken floor and pulls his hand down, offering help and shouting that he will try to hold the young master back. A moment later, the guard received a powerful fist punch to the cheek and blood spurted from his nose. The man's gaze faded, and he flew off to the side, leaving an air vortex behind him, leaving a trail of Hyun's blow in the thick dust. The guy climbs out of the pit, and his Suli begins to loom in the cloud of dust and says he won't run since they started this fight themselves. Hyun admits that S rank is much different, drinks 3 potions to restore fatigue, stamina, and mana, empty bubbles falling to the floor. The guy smiled confidently, covered in energy. His eye changed color and he spun a ball of mana in his hand, saying that now he wouldn't hold back either. The manager of the lecture is summoned by the chairman sitting at his desk with his arms folded in front of him, and the man standing with his arms crossed behind his back. The chairman is taken aback when the manager reports the performance of the 2 guys. He doesn't believe it's possible. The manager standing guard confirmed that the data was accurate, and there was no doubt that these 2 S rank awakened. The girls studying the report widened their eyes in surprise, and holding the folders in their hands said that such figures were enough to become ranked players. The chairman laughed and said that Korea would finally have its own saint, and the man lowered his gaze and mentally chuckled. The saint, one of Japan's top players, a monster with a value exceeding 2,500 after being tested at the age of 18. The girl has a terrifying aura, that's right. Even this monster's value barely surpassed 2,500. The manager doesn't know what to say about the guy who has a reading of 5,096. The man was covered by a shadow and his eyes bulged again. As he left, the man wondered if he had just imagined it or if he had miscalculated. Walking silently down the corridor, accompanied by the guards, the man kept thinking about the boy. The man looked up, frowned, and confidently decided he had to check things out for himself. The bodyguard recovered from the blow and opened his eyes wide, covered in sweat, and stunned said it couldn't be. The man looked up shocked, kneeling, and asked how this was possible and clenched his fists. Hyun stands in front of the monster and reaches forward, releasing his spiky vines on his opponent, immobilizing him, and the monster roars loudly. The monster tries to fight back, but the pressure from the binding squeezing it is so powerful that it splits the monster's head open. Lee, holding control over the monster, panicked and put even more effort into it. The smile slipped off his face and he asked what was even going on. The red-haired man began to try even harder, while asking perplexedly how this beggar was able to suppress his power. After all, he is the heir of the Tezen group and S rank. Lee became furious, cracks appearing on his face from overexertion, and he continued to shout. The redhead shouted that he was Lee Changjae and put all his strength into the monster. The monster opened its mouth wide and headed towards Hyun to devour him. Hyun, continuing to attack with his waves, didn't budge and said that he didn't care whose heir Lee was and his rank didn't matter at all. The guy smilingly looked at the monster with a burning eye. Releasing his spiky vines at his opponent, explained that the power of a king flows in him. The redhead screamed and rushed forward, but a sharp pain pierced his shoulder, the waves released by his opponent hitting all over his body. Lee stopped and froze. Looking up, he saw a powerful man grit his teeth and thrust forward a palm pierced with black flames. The bully's knees buckled as he opened his mouth in amazement to see several vines flying at him. The bewildered boy stared wide-eyed as the fetters approached, but did not act, so shocked was he. Several beams merged together and glittered as they hit the target, then narrowed down to a small star. The outside of the building has not changed in any way, nor can it be seen through the windows that there is a fierce battle going on inside. A moment later, the building explodes, breaking the barrier set up by the bodyguard. Smoke and fire soared into the sky, surrounded by sparks of Hyun's energy. The auditorium is completely destroyed, the fire burning inside and the ceiling bursting with rocks. The defeated Lee Changjae lies wounded and unconscious on the ruined floor. The bodyguard stands aside with his mouth open, his whole body shaking from the incident, sweat streaming down his face. Hyun stands over the loser, looking at him disdainfully and satisfied, and said he surprised himself. A bodyguard appears between Hyun standing and Lee lying down. He dropped to one knee and looked at the guy panting. Hyun thought that he didn't expect how a ranked player, Seol Hongdo, could drag the gentleman away right in the process of hunting. He pulled him out from under the attack. Standing in front of the man, Hyun thought that he didn't care now, since he had already gotten the skill, and the guard asked what he was going to do next. The man continued to kneel and warned that the young lord was the heir, and there would be consequences after this battle. The guy replied that he wasn't the first to start the fight, appealed to the man's conscience, and asked with a smile if he looked like the kind of person who would fear such threats. Hyun reassured the bodyguard by telling him not to worry, because he wasn't going to kill his master. The guy added that in exchange for his mercy, he would put a price on Lee's life, which stunned the man. He opened his eyes even wider and blew up. The bodyguard was stunned beyond belief, and the guy continued, "Since Lee is the heir to the Taesan group, the price should be accordingly." Hyun put a hand to his wounded face and pretended to think about it with a mocking smile. The guy creased his eyebrows and threw his finger aside, smugly asking if the guard was willing to pay 1 billion won since they owed him now. The auditorium building was on fire and smoke was billowing out of it. Rocks were piled everywhere, and a crowd of schoolchildren, led by a nurse, had gathered around. The woman shouts for everyone to move back, and Ayun stands among the kids with his mouth wide open, as shocked as the rest of the crowd. The girl felt whose magic and strongest flame it was. There was no doubt it was Lee Changji's power, and Ayun was even more surprised. Thinking of who Lee might be fighting, Ayun envisioned a picture of him taunting Hyun, showing off his strength, but dismissed the thought. As soon as the nurse was distracted by stopping the guys, Ayun quickly brushed past her and headed straight for the building. Noticing that Ayun had sprinted past and was confidently running forward, the woman awed and called out to her. Terror froze in the girl's gasps. The girl ran to the door with fire and smoke billowing behind her. She thought she was wrong to let the guys alone in the gym. Yoon runs into the gym. The fire is burning everywhere. She mentally calls out to Hyun and thinks he's responsible for what happened. The girl looks into the hall. Ice flakes fly from her face, and she thought in a plea, walking, the guy survived. The ice lady saw not at all what she expected. On the floor, unconscious, lying Lee, with his mouth open and all wounded. Hyun stands in the clouds of smoke and smiles awkwardly, keeping his hands in his pockets and looking at the girl with the eyes of a caught criminal. And Yoon stops in front of him and stands like a stumbling block. Humbly lowering her hands, she looks at the winner. The girl was so stunned that she didn't immediately realize what Hyun was talking about. He said he needed help carrying the body to the nursing station or hospital. And Yoon lifted Lee by his shoulders and put her knee under him, asking Hyun what was going on here. The guy only scratched the back of his head and tried to justify himself. The girl looked at the redhead and couldn't believe he could have gotten hurt like that falling down the stairs. And Hyun added that he had nothing to do with it. The guy said he was off, and the girl quickly turned around and jumped up from her seat, stopping Hyun and asking him to explain himself properly. Holding Lee in her lap, the girl looks questioningly at the spot where Hyun was just standing. He disappeared again without a trace and quietly. The girl is amazed at how a guy can disappear so instantly and is left alone with Lee. Hyun uses stealth to evade Ayun's questions and only appears outside of town on the mountain with a relieved exhale. The guy stands on the side of the road and says that the girl will handle Lee somehow and takes in groups to fulfill his conditions, so that's the end of it. Suddenly, a skill scoreboard appears in front of the guy, and he stares at it dazedly, asking what else he sees as his stats go up. Carefully studying the scoreboard, Hyun saw that he got charm. Isn't it about the appearance of celebrities? And he can't believe that hunting took that away from Lee. Hyun also got the monk's heart skill, which increases the characteristics of the group members. And the guy is surprised that Lee had such a skill. The guy smiled, rather smiling, looking at the scoreboard and said, "That's just excellent." Hyun knows that skills that affect the whole group are rare, and if he uses a few skills and activates the monk's heart, he will become stronger. The guy excitedly went further and thought that getting such a skill is tinny how awesome. Hyun heard a noise behind him and turned around. 3 cars stopped behind him, and the guy looked at them questioningly. The sounds of slamming car doors were heard, and the guy froze in amazement. A man approaches Hyun and says that they finally found him. A hiring manager with a security team stood in front of the guy and said he had a lot of questions for him. The man started, and the guy still can't come to his senses, wondering how he got here, looking at him with huge surprised eyes. Go-Tok, covered in his aura, asked what the guy was doing in the gym earlier and started drilling him with disgruntled eyes. The bodyguard returned to the mansion in the late afternoon with a report. The pathway is lit by the frequently placed lanterns. The man set down a glass of drink and ice with a quiet clatter. He wondered what the guard would say to his question. Under the barking of Dobermans, the man continued that his only son and heir is hospitalized. Lee's father is outraged. That's not all. Hyung is demanding 1 billion won for his son's life to settle the matter quietly. He looked at the shaking bodyguard. The guard stands in front of the Lord and stammeringly asks for forgiveness. The bodyguard has lowered his head and stares at the floor. He is overcome with fear. Drops of sweat dripping down his chin and dripping down because he has nothing to say. The boss finally orders Hyun to comply, and the guard is discouraged, raising his head and asking if he understood correctly. The man raised the finger of the hand resting on the armrest upward and added that the boy was confident, and it was interesting. Lee's father folded his fingers in the shape of a gun and said that for the price they would pay, a corresponding reward should follow. The bodyguard looked away confused as shadows grew over him, and he realized what kind of people the boss had summoned. The bodyguard yelled out in shock that Hyun was only a boy, and this would be too cruel. The president put his foot on his leg and told the guard to shut up. He wasn't going to listen to a barking dog. Covered in flames, he let the dogs down. The owner's face contorted with a predatory smile, his eyes brutally lit up and flames raging around him. He himself is S-ranked player Lee Chang-soo and the head of the Tessen group. The manager standing in front of Hyun asked what they had set up in the gym. The guy stares at them mesmerized, not understanding where they came from. The guy hesitated and only remembered 2 events in the gym. When talking about the gym, he means the explosion or the situation during the lecture. Which one is it? Hyun looked at the tired manager and thought, considering his situation, the chance of him coming to deal with the explosion himself is small. The guy figured that if the man already knew he set up the explosion and decided to check it out, nervous and smiling, Hyun asked about the gym and the explosion in it. It turned out the manager didn't know anything about the explosion and surprisingly questioned the guy about it. The man turned around and looked at the city and saw smoke billowing from the side of the school. He said that everything is under control there. Other people will take care of it. The manager and the guards put their hands in their pockets, and the man noticed that he still hadn't gotten an answer to his question. The guy smiled widely because the manager doesn't know the real cause of the explosion, and he asked the guy again what he was doing in the gym. The guy stands in front of the manager in the middle of the road and asked him if he didn't know yet and fell silent, thinking over every word. The man asked in surprise what he was supposed to know, and the guy replied that he must have come to give an invitation to sectionals for the players. The manager was amused by the guy's assumption and laughed as he answered on what basis the guy should get to the sectionals. The guy started to get covered in energy and said that if he needed a reason, he was ready to show it. Hyun put on his aura and his eye changed color. Smiling smugly, he asked if that wasn't enough, showing his numbers again. The man in the bodyguard looked at the figures and marveled. The numbers show 5,214, and he thought that can't be. The manager and the bodyguards took a step back. The man looking at the guy in the attire realized that that number is not a coincidence at all, but a skill error. Hyun stands smiling, showing his strength, and the man still can't realize who he is. When the manager comes to his senses, he asks what's wrong with the guy's clothes, and his fervor fades at the unexpected question. The guy got home after dark, and immediately the question about the qualifying players came up. Jiyeon burst into Hyung's room and shouted, "If Hyung Neem is really going to participate in the qualifiers," the guy replied by lifting a dumbbell that it's in a month. The cousin couldn't believe his ears. He bared his eyes at his brother and opened his mouth wide in amazement. He was instantly covered in sweat. Jiyeon pictured his cousin on the throne with a crown on his head. He bowed low on his knees and gathered all the titles of the higher ranks in one word. The guy is working hard with the dumbbell and thinking, Taesun took good care of the explosion, and Go didn't suspect anything. We need to get ready for sectionals. Hyun thought there shouldn't be any more problems, but his phone rang and he shifted his gaze to it, but took his time picking it up. The phone rings and vibrates insistently. The number is undetectable. Hyun doesn't know who could be calling him at this late hour. The guy is practicing at home, and the hunters are already waiting for him outside. The hunter grabs Hyun's bodyguard and asks why an association player is guarding some high school kid's house. The mummy-like man lifted the guard over the edge of the roof and said he was annoyed, while the other smilingly kept his eyes on the kid's house. The bandit with the bag over his head suggests that Hyun is one of the candidates for sectionals, and the association is really shaking for his future. A duo of killer black and white brothers arrive at the guy's house, and one of them thinks that the candidate is just an inexperienced kid. The black brother stood up, pulled his kunai out of his sleeves, and spread his arms, saying he didn't care what his name was, and laughed hysterically. The older one turned to the younger one with a frantic look and offered to prove who the real awakened ones were here, and turned around. What he saw shocked the black man. His eyes nearly popped out of his orbits. The man grabbed the white man by the throat and held him over the edge of the roof. The older man was enraged by what he saw. His eyes lit up and he attacked the offender. The guy knocked out the white man, turned to the other brother, and tossed the defeated one aside with a smile on his face. The black man's eyes widened in amazement as he started to attack. Hyun jumped high and struck the older one with his knee to the face, covering him with the stone skin skill. Blood splattered in different directions. With one powerful blow, the black brother blacks out, his gaze fading. Hyun, smiling at the quick victory over the mercenaries, smiles and calls the eldest of them an inexperienced boy, as he once called him the same. During the battle in the hall, the boy announces the price for Lee's life as 1 billion won, the guard stammering to ask if he heard the amount correctly. The guard panicked, because in addition to keeping silent about what happened, he doesn't solve financial matters on his own. The guy raised his hand and said he knew. The guy stated that he's not an asshole who throws all the work off on sixes and asked the man to help make a positive decision. Hyun warned that he wouldn't tolerate betrayal, and he extended his hand, in which chains covered in aura appeared, which scared the bodyguard. The guy offered to make a deal with the awakened ones. Chains appeared around him and his finger, and he smirked smugly, holding out his hand. Hearing the terms of the deal, the man is dumbfounded because along with the payment of money, he must completely hide the cause of the explosion in the gym. A journalist stands against the background of the burning building and tells that the cause of the fire in the gym of the Tessin school was a gas fire. No one was injured. The voiced second condition was fulfilled by the first. It is to inform in advance if the guy is in danger with the purpose of revenge. The bodyguard went out into the woods to make the call. He introduced himself, closed his eyes, and clenched his fist. The man, covered in sweat with a confident look, says he wants to warn of assassins bound by the oath of the awakened. The black brother quickly regains his senses, and with a sharp movement of his hand tries to strike Hyun. He clenches his teeth and stares with wild eyes. The guy gave his opponent an indifferent look and began to deftly dodge the attacks and fight back with his bare hands. Hyun grouped himself and looked closely at his opponent, set aside his elbow and skidded his arm at great speed. The guy spread his legs wide and released a powerful stream of air towards his opponent. Black managed to dodge and finds himself behind the guy. He jumped up and is heading for an attack in Hyun's back. With a powerful blow, the enemy collapsed on Hyun, his kunai slamming into the floor and sending rocks flying in different directions, kicking up dust. Black looked at the spot he attacked, and his eyes widened. He heard the guy address him by the duo's nickname. Hyun said he had heard of them and their skills and thanked him for it, coming up behind his enemy and putting his foot on his head, putting him in a stupor. The guy, smiling ironically, added that they were otherwise losers, covered in an aura of hunting, and his eye changed color. A black car is speeding down the highway at night in the city. The girl sitting in the car is talking on the phone. She heard that a candidate has been chosen for the preliminaries, and it was answered into the tube that only the best will be there. The tramp looks at the phone with a smile, asking who the chairman is so eager to meet, and tries to guess the candidate. The man stands in the office looking out the large window and replies, laughing, that S-rank Shin Yunbak is also famous, but he doesn't want to see him at all. The chairman laughed briefly and informed the tramp that he was referring to her younger sister. The girl hesitated, for her family would not tolerate that, and the man replied, laughing, that she was still just as cruel. The man asked who the girl Shin Yunbak Lee waiting for. She looked out the window, only smilingly hummed. The girl said yes, but she wants to hear something funny. The chairman hesitated and asked what funny thing she was talking about. Tramp reported that, ignoring all the S-rankers, the deputy manager personally contacted one student, and he really did. A duo of unconscious brothers sit by a breached wall. The guy overpowered both of them, and at the same time the girl says she's curious how good he is. Rocks start falling on the bandits from the broken wall, but they're both out. They've been well roughed up by the guy. Hyun looks surprised at his raised hand, which is briefly sparked by the energy of the hunt, and asked what's wrong now. The guy saw a scoreboard that said he had a lack of physical ability and using hunting was impossible until the reset was complete. The night street is empty, but still a few people summoned by Hyun show up. The guards saw a duo of mercenary black and white brothers. They sit tied with their backs to each other against a broken wall. The girl resents the way the bandits are acting, and the guy notices that they've gotten too separated lately. Go and Hyun standing behind the guards' backs. The manager thanks Hyun for telling him about the attack and asks if he knows who's behind it and picks up his phone. The guy remained silent. Guy looked at the manager carefully and wondered if he should tell him. Hyun abruptly turned away, looked at his feet, and replied that he wasn't sure what he was guessing. The man stared at his phone screen and assumed that the list of participants had leaked online and needed to beef up security at the others. The guy thought about the Tucson groups, but his eye lit up and energy waves went back into his hand. He decided he had bigger problems. Hyun looked at his arm and realized that it turns out he won't be able to use hunting until his physical abilities are sufficient. The guy wandered down the street alone and thinks, what's wrong with this skill? Is it really only left to increase his characteristics? Hyun realizes that failure is imminent without hunting, because it requires a battle with monsters to increase rank. He stops and thinks that he can fight the awakened to improve his performance, but he needs to hunt. Hyun grunted and looked forward with defiance, saying that apparently he had no other choice. The guy came to the biggest training center in the city, with various machines already parked around it. The sign says Blackhead and has a logo in the form of a black head with a huge nose, eyes looking in different directions, small hands and feet. At the entrance greets a girl of athletic build and holds out with a smile the registration form said that she is Hyun's guide in the training center. The girl smilingly introduced herself, put 2 fingers to her face, winked, and asked how she could help. Hyun came with his cousin, who resents his brother for choosing this center where you have to meet the criteria and have money. The girl sees the kids and tries to send them back, saying this center isn't right for them, but Hun quickly holds out her credit card. The guy showed a super VIP card when he signed a contract with the alchemists and asked to enroll the 2 of them. The girl is involuntarily surprised. Hyun asks with a smile if a card from one of the 4 guilds is enough to check. The brother looks at the card questioningly, and the girl recognizes it by the crest. The guy across the street stands with his arm outstretched and smiles. And Yura thinks where the boy got the card from. Maybe he's an apprentice of a high-ranked player. The girl nervously wondered if he was the owner of the card, and if she agreed, there could be trouble and how she should proceed. One athlete laughed and said it looked like Yura was in a tight spot, and the girl turned around aghast as she continued to hold the card in her hands. The jock flaunted his muscles, lifted his leg, and winked, saying that money alone wasn't enough to sign up, clearly embarrassing the girl. Ji-yeon mumbled that Iron Strongman was in front of them. What should they do? The girl covered her mouth with her hands, and Hyung looked at the jock with an indifferent look. Iron informed that the rookie killer in front of them, the other athletes turned around and felt sorry for the guys, calling them poor kids. The jock continues to squirm in front of Hyun and chuckle. Hyun couldn't stand it and asked what the weakling was babbling about. Iron's face changed dramatically. Usually everyone shakes when they hear his name, and he glared angrily at the guy. Ji-yeon was startled by his brother's behavior and called out to him, his eyes bulging and his hands up, the girl holding her hand to her lips looking dumbfounded at the daredevil. Iron looked at his muscles and furrowed his brows. The vein on his temple swelled with tension, and he asked how dare the guy call him weak. The guy looked confidently at the jock, smiled and said that if he didn't believe him, they could bet and the loser would pay for a year's membership. The man laughed loudly and said the guy doesn't know his place at all. He agreed and is making his own terms. Jock and Hyun put on virtual reality goggles, teleported to a place teeming with different monsters, and found themselves on a rocky path. The screen above shows the location of the competitors, though they are sitting in chairs, and the other athletes have started cheering for them, raising their hands in the air. Ji-yeon stands amongst the cheering crowd with a stunned expression on her face and doesn't realize what it is, then guesses it's the Abyss. The girl in front of her explains that it's a virtual reality program called a Gatekeeper, and her cousin repeats it behind her. Hyun sits in a chair with goggles, his hands resting in special capsules. The Gatekeeper reproduces the environment of the Abyss for the contest. In the Abyss, one must destroy as many BA rank monsters as possible in the shortest amount of time, while holding no small amount of weight. Yura added that this is the most popular way to establish a hierarchy within the training center, but against a jock, a guy doesn't stand a chance, and the game begins. Iron laughed smugly, furrowed his eyebrows, and lowered his head with a fierce gleam in his eyes. A jock with a backpack on his shoulders rushes at the monster, swinging his fist and saying that a dumb little kid dared to challenge him. The man smugly declared that his skill of increasing muscle mass makes him invincible, and he strikes the monster. Iron pushed off the ground with force, breaking through the rock, and declared that his mobility, the most powerful skill in the Gatekeeper. The jock attacking the monsters knocked out a few combos and attacked again. He confidently stated that he would gratefully use the annual pass. The jock's attention was caught by a light behind him. He turned around in surprise, frowned, and the smile slid off his face. The guy walked lightning fast around Iron and destroyed the monsters around him. Fire burned in his hand, and his eyes shone with a new light. He was serious. Hyun has lined up a route for the attack in the form of arrows, and in this corridor get monsters flying straight at him. The guy destroys the monsters he meets on the way, and the color of the arrows changes. Hyun is gaining momentum. Seriously and confidently, he delivers blow after blow, his eyes shining with a new brilliance. A multitude of monsters swarmed at the guy, snarling wildly. They thrust their paws in his direction but ran into the light barrier. With the strongest kick of his leg, Hyun hits several monsters at the same time and falls into the barrier of the Abyss. Some monsters froze watching him. The guy reincarnates, his eyes sparkling with purple lightning, and he is covered in a light aura, smiling. The crawling monsters open their mouths and a stream of air rushes down. Iron knocked one monster and stood there like a statue and paid attention to the combo the guy had gotten, which was 999. The guy exhaled and said that he didn't plan to stay here for more than a month, and the jock was completely shocked, standing there with his mouth hanging open. The audience is also discouraged, and only Jian stands with a placard in his hands that says he believes in his brother and holds back tears. Hyun lands in front of the stunned man and says he calls himself Aaron Strongman and the fight wasn't that bad. A winner sign appeared above the guy and he smiled contentedly, still holding his weight over his shoulders. He told the jock to pay up and get lost. On the outskirts of the city stands a huge stadium, and a helicopter flies around it. The announcer says that the day they've been waiting for has finally arrived. Crowds of players have gathered around, and a slight crush begins. Everyone wants to get closer to watch the exam for the player's license. The reporters broadcast from the helicopter and announced that the rules have changed and now minors can participate too. The anchorwoman began to introduce the awakened ones they were looking forward to, and the first undefeated melee fighter is Iron Fist. A druid was introduced second, not even the AE's ranks looking at his outstanding combat flair. Third came out the god of Thunder of Busan holding a lightning bolt, an S-ranked challenger. The one who is rumored to have performed the best among the testees, the future Saint AE's ranked, came out fourth. People gathered from all over the country to watch the talented individuals willing to participate in the event. One girl walks with sunglasses on, AS, and complains that it's a long way to walk. A new journalist, Psy Economy, is on her way in order to interview and film the qualifiers, and if she doesn't make it in time today, she will be fired. The girl approached the stadium, but there are so many people there that it is impossible to push through. Psy fell on her knees behind the crowd and said that at this rate, he will not take a single interview. She will be lucky if at least take a photo. The girl fell into despair with her head bowed low, thinking that with her E rank, she's destined to fail time after time, but Hyun comes up behind her. The guy scowled and asked how come there were so many people here. The girl turned around at the sound, tears welling up in her eyes and her lips tightened. Hyun asks how the contestants in the sectionals are supposed to get through. Psy rounds her eyes full of tears and realizes she has a chance. A guy walks by smiling and calling out to God. Psy kneels down and folds her hands between her legs, happy for the opportunity. The participant of the qualifiers, Kim Taehyun S rank, walks to the stadium smiling and looking lazily ahead. He said cheerfully how much he is pissed off by what is happening. The girl crawled over and pulled a trembling hand towards Hyun and asked if he would let her interview him. The guy, keeping his hands in his pockets, turned around surprised. The huge perimeter of the stadium was surrounded by the arriving spectators and participants. The guy made his way through the crowd, and at the entrance for the contestants, he was greeted by the manager of the qualifiers, inviting him in and informing him that he had a minute's notice. Hyun sighed and realized he was almost late because of the interview Psy was giving. He looked forward confidently and smiled happily. The guy walked inside and thought that he should take care of his reputation beforehand, but as he entered, he saw a huge crowd of participants. The waiting room was noisy. Each participant was given a badge with a personal number. The walls and floors in the lounge are tiled with the same tiles, and the participants gathered inside are looking around. Several guys simultaneously and excitedly turned their heads in the same direction. And Yoon, like everyone else, opened her mouth in surprise and a drop of sweat ran down her cheek. Hyun looked away calmly without any obvious emotion. And Yoon saw the guy and called his name questioningly. She didn't expect to see him. He smiled back and faked surprise at her presence. The girl raised her hand and asked with rounded eyes what was wrong with his body, but the guy realized what she meant and said that he was a little more fit. And Yoon is dumbfounded, looking at the guy open his mouth, and thought that for him it is a little. But can you change so much in a month? The girl quickly came to her senses, and with her hands spread, she asked him what he did to Lee last time. The guy looked at her in surprise and remained silent. Finally, an announcement was heard for the young people with a greeting, and silhouettes of people appeared on the screen. Everyone cheered and turned to the sound. A long-haired man with glasses appeared on the screen and started a speech that he would explain the rules of the exam at the first selection test of becoming players. The man asked to pay attention to his breasts because everyone is assigned a unique number, and the girl was surprised to see it. This time the exam is to collect 5 unique numbers, including the guy's own. If the number is lost, the player is eliminated. The man from the screen raises his hand up showing 5 fingers and said that many people call it a race for exam tickets. The examiner adds that the time limit is an hour. Suddenly the floor fails and participants start falling in a blinded state. In this test, everything is allowed except killing. The contestants began to deftly jump from the platforms, the entire arena rearranging and dividing into blocks. The man smiled contentedly and thundered in anticipation, "Let the testing begin." On each large block, the face of the examiner is displayed. Some of the guys are already starting to act, and some of them are standing there with their mouths hanging open in bewilderment. On one of the blocks, Ah-yoon is standing and one guy points at her and yells at her to be dealt with before she is dealt with. The crowd of guys headed towards her. The girl's eyes lit up and she glared at them. She looked seriously at her opponents and released energy from her fingertips, preparing to attack. The observers watched the ordeal through the screen as a block of ice formed around Ah-yoon, and the attackers were thrown in different directions. On the other side of the screen, everything was covered in frost, and one of the watchers noticed that the girl claiming to be a rank saint had great potential. The man replied that it was better not to joke with the other contestants either. Each of them surpassed the other applicants, and he turned his attention to the guy. The examiners wait for Shin Yun-bak's actions. 20 minutes passed, and no one could even get close to him. He fights back with one hand with a smile. The opponents approaching Shin shouted, girded with something that looked like electric shocks. The man noted that the guy had a truly amazing talent. In the same room as the manager, he is poking at the screen, not paying attention to the comments. Guo stepped away from the screen and turned to look at the people watching, thinking that the interest in some of the contestants was understandable given their ranks. The man thought about Hyun. After all, he had seen that unimaginable number and he would manage to pass the stage. The screen beeped and the man looked up nervously. Seeing the data on the screen, the man smiled happily and mentally encouraged the guy to show them all he could and the strength he had. The manager looked questioningly at what was happening to the guy and he was shocked. The guy was in hand-to-hand combat with one opponent. The man jumped away from the screen dumbfounded, bulging his eyes and opening his mouth. He can't believe what's happening and says, "That's it, stop." Guo whined and swore in a frenzy, sputtering sweat and saliva, eyes glaring at the screen with rage. A rank awakened Hong Young-guk. His skill is skin of steel and he receives blow after blow from Hyun, pieces of steel flying around. C-rank awakened Kim Tae-hyun with the skill of stone skin with a smile, allows himself to be cramped by his opponent and deftly dodges his attacks. The manager spread his arms out confusedly and thought he had overestimated Hyun's capabilities and thought he wasn't dodging at all. The man shook his head, looked carefully at the screen and thought that the guy was dodging after all. He's shocked beyond belief. Hyun gathers himself, swings his fist and runs at his opponent with his teeth clenched, and he runs towards him. He waits until he's close enough to make a fist and looks at him with a sly smile, his eyes full of excitement. Hong hurt Hyun badly, hitting him in the leg with a powerful attack, rocks and blood flying in different directions. Hyun fell down and spit out the blood with his head bowed, while his opponent reprimanded and asked why he was looking down on him and took a fighting stance again. Young-guk shouted that Hyun's stone was only a pathetic parody of his steel. On top of that, even fighting close, the guy's blows would never reach him. Hyun's eyes went blank from the powerful blow, and he heard the guy ask him if he would ever shut up. Hyun pushed himself off the ground and quickly headed towards his opponent. He smiled again. The guys hit each other's face powerfully at the same time. Steel and rocks flew in different directions, and blood dripped from their fists. The guys were swept away from each other. Hyun deftly turned around and looked at his opponent with predator's eyes and thought that his training was not over yet. The opponent continues to fall backwards and screams that Hyun is a damn monster, steel armor crumbling on his face. The opponent falls unconscious right in front of the guy, raising a cloud of dust around him. Hyun victoriously tears the unique number off his opponent's chest, looks at it, and smiles. Now he has 2 numbers. The manager, who had been watching the fight all this while, laughed nervously and cheerfully. Guo raised his hands up, threw his head back, laughed and shouted that the guy was a scumbag, thus attracting the attention of the examiners. The man looked at the screen again and clenched his fist joyfully, thinking that he couldn't believe that he was practicing right in the middle of a large-scale assignment. The guy, wounded and tired, walked on, and Guo thought that his recklessness was giving him the creeps, and it might be a problem now. Guo is already thinking about the guy's strategy. Right now, he'd better recover his stamina and target the weakest participant. The manager's plans were not going to come true. Looking at the screen, he was dumbfounded again, and his eyes bulged. In the hall, among the observers began to discontent and laugh at the guy. He with C rank understands whether against whom he is going, or he decided to leave the game. Hyun walks up to Shin, with many defeated contestants around him, and they stand on neighboring hanging platforms looking at each other. Shin smugly asks who they have here and folds his arms across his chest with 147 unique numbers hanging from his chest. Hyun was surprised at the number of numbers that his opponent had collected and started counting them out loud with his finger, standing on the platform upside down. The guy smiled contentedly, clenched his fist, and said he didn't care because there were definitely more than 5 badges. There was an explosion on one of the blocks and dust mixed with electrical discharges. The attack resembles the fall of a meteorite, with a core in the center and dust and lightning scattering the space around it. Shin attacks with a powerful mixture of earth and lightning, and Hyun deftly dodges without giving a chance to get hit. His opponent's eyes light up. He smiles smugly and points his finger, conducting an electric current through it. Hyun makes big and fast jumps, easily avoiding direct hits. He focused on dodging, and his face became serious. In flight, the guy activated the stone skin skill on the front of his leg. Quickly turning around, he is carried at breakneck speed towards the opponent to strike him with his foot. In flight, his stone crumbles. The opponent releases his discharges, blocking the guy's attack, and the stone on his foot instantly crumbles. Hyun's stones fly at himself. He is surprised and blacks out, and the opponent asks if he's hustling. The opponent looks with burning eyes, and with a smile faces the guy's leg, holding it with his lightning, saying he can't keep up with his attacks. There is another explosion on the platform, even stronger than before, the shockwave blowing rocks away. The dust disperses and Hyun lands on the next block with a soft thud, watching his opponent from above, standing in an electrified field. The guy tries to catch his breath and looks closely at his opponent, recognizing the thunder god from Busan. It's hard to get close to him. Shin has tracked Hyun, his pupils narrowed. He smilingly points his hand in his direction, collecting lightning, and the guy realizes that it won't be easy with his opponent. The opponent not only covers himself with powerful discharges, but also blocks all of the guy's attacks with them. Hyun realized that Shin has enough power to actively attack both short and long distances. The guy whined and wondered, given that hunting was not available to him right now, how he could break through his opponent's defenses. Shin stretched his lips into a smirk and asked the guy why he wasn't approaching and if he wanted him to approach him himself. The guy's eyes filled with terror. He stares wide-eyed. In the blink of an eye, the opponent bridges the distance between them, swinging with multiple lightning bolts in his hand with a smile. Shin delivers a powerful blow, and the guy barely manages to dodge it with clenched teeth. His hand swept over his shoulder, and he lingers his gaze on it. A crushing leg kick follows, and Hyun manages to jerk his leg away and jump away. Shin again gathers the electrified energy in his hand and swings with lightning covering his palm. The opponent strikes the platforms with blow after blow, and the guy technically dodges, stepping back each time. The opponent is not on a joke. Laughing, he pursues Hyun, accumulates lightning in his hands, and asks where he is going. The guy stops abruptly and folds his arms in a cross to protect his chest, and the opponent strikes with such force that the discharges fly in different directions. Hyun is hit by an electric discharge, and he grunts, punctured by a multitude of lightning bolts. He throws his head back and can't move. His rival's eyes get all wild. Continuing to hit the guy with the discharges, he laughs and asks, "Didn't Hyun want to fight? Then there was no need to run away." The guy grits his teeth and tries to resist the attack, gradually building up a stone skin on himself. Finally, the guy exhaled. He managed to build up a block of stone on his arm and burst out of the discharges, attacking Shin with a loud scream. He jumps back. Backing away slightly, Shin snaps his fingers and smilingly calls the guy a dumbass. A glare appears in his palm, and the stone block collapses into small pieces. Hyun's feet rest against the wall of the platform, and he is blinded by the bright light caused by the glare of the enemy. The guy is pressed against the wall. He protects his face with his hands and squeezes his eyes tightly shut. Hyun covers his face with the back of his palm and tries to see through the bright light the location of the enemy, and his eyes are distorted. The enemy has jumped high up and is holding a ball of lightning in his hand, preparing for another attack. Shin swung his hand, withdrew his index finger, and the orb in his palm disappeared, covering it with new discharges. Hyun flies down and stares dumbfounded at his opponent with his arms crossed over his chest and his teeth clenched. The opponent sharply lowers his hands down, and a lot of lightning bolts from all sides fly at the guy and break the platform under him. The guy is hit by the discharges and screams in sudden pain as he continues to cover his head with his hands. Shin laughs again and continues throwing lightning bolts at the guy, saying that the guy is something to behold. The opponent smilingly continues to strike the guy with lightning and keeps his eyes on him in surprise, feeling that he's having fun. Shin remembers all the times he watched the others run away from his attacks, the fear of imminent defeat on their faces. While he's fighting the weaklings, he thinks the only one who can really entertain him at these preliminaries will be Ayun. The opponent looked at Hyun with wild rage and thought that it turns out there was still him and called him a funny little toy. Suddenly from the guy's side, something flew at great speed toward Shin. The opponent's head snapped back and blood spurted out, but he continued to maintain electric shocks around him. The stunned opponent didn't realize what happened. A smile came off his face and he looked at his blood just flying in front of his eyes. The next blow hit his opponent's back. He shifted his gaze, trying to look back, not realizing what was happening, And from there, Hyun was throwing rocks. Shin thought, remembering the battle, that the guy couldn't reach him and only dodged attacks or defended himself from the blows. Suddenly, the opponent is pierced by a sharp pain from behind. He spread his arms and legs and promptly flew down with his mouth wide open. Shin's eyes go blank and he coughs. He can no longer maintain his electric shocks from his wounds and they disappear. Hyun, striking, said Stone's skin certainly doesn't compare to the fury of the Thunder God. The veins on his arm inflated and the stone breaks. The guy thought that even a perfect use of the skill doesn't make it possible to break through to Shin, but the qualifying platform is different. The platform was created from a material that could withstand the force of the Awakened One, so the shard wouldn't crumble after the collision. The guy guessed that he could use the local blocks as weapons, only needing to somehow find a gap in the Thunder God's defense. Hyun smiled and addressed Shin by name, holding the block torn from the platform in his hand, and flashed a confident look. The angered opponent howled and splattered blood and gave Hyun a fierce look and begins to release discharges around his body from the last of his strength. Without waiting for the attack, the guy hits forward with a block torn from the platform. Shin, covered in lightning, flies away, and the badges from his body explode. The opponent falls unconscious, his glasses and numerous badges flying around him. Hyun thought that he would be able to resist him anymore. He looks at his defeated opponent with undisguised joy, the remnants of lightning still glittering nearby, dust and stones flying in the air. The onlookers watch as Hyun's powerful lightning-fast strike collapses the platform, and they stand frozen in silence. A crowd of gawkers watch through the screen, asking what the hell, how S rank could lose to C rank, and staring puzzled. Someone asked who Taehyun even was, and the manager, holding his chin and smiling, pointed out that only this guy could make people nervous. The man's face changed dramatically and he frowned slightly. He had seen something unimaginable. Hyun walked up to his opponent, who was lying passed out in a pile of stones and badges, and the guy takes only 3 of them and tiredly exhaled. The guy happily looked at the 3 unique numbers and said that with that, the task was done. All that was left was to wait for the end. A block of ice flies towards Hyun at a great speed, slicing through the air with a whoosh. The guy manages to jump from the surprise. He looks surprised as the ice breaks through the platform, and Shin begins to slide off it. The ice block was cold, and the guy looked at it dumbfounded, his eyes rounded. Hyun looked up and noticed a 6-pointed star seal and rocks falling from above. A crust of ice began to appear over one of the broken platforms, and the falling rocks flew off to the side. Gradually, the platform turns out to be in a ball on which ice blocks are growing. The guy opened his eyes in surprise. He is shocked by what is happening, and he realizes whose handiwork it is. The ball of ice grows and begins to cover the platform from all sides, hiding the contents inside from view. The dome is lined with a variety of snowflakes all around. Beautiful snowflakes of huge sizes appear all over the training area, and the ice crust is almost completely covered in ice. Hyun is trapped in an ice trap. Even here it's snowing inside, left alone with Ayun, who is confidently heading towards him. The girl comes closer and closer with a vague expression on her face, her body covered in blue energy. The wounded guy stares at her in surprise and opens his mouth in astonishment. And Yun walks forward with her head proudly raised, with her eyes burning and fists clenched. The girl stopped opposite, a rift in the floor separating them. The guy was confused, tense, and wondering what she was doing here and how much she had time to see. And Yoon stumped the guy by saying that she believes that with great power comes great responsibility. The girl quite seriously added that power without responsibility is pure evil. The girl puzzled the guy by saying that he is strong and she would never think he could overpower Shin Yunbak. The guy protested. And Yun stretched her hand forward and added that this was how he defeated Lee Changjie. Energy flirted around her. She got angry at the guy. The guy got chills from the girl's words. He was stunned to the point where he couldn't utter a word. The girl released an airwave at the guy from her palm. Rocks flew from the place of impact, and the guy instantly disappeared. And Yun, without lowering his hand, stands with burning eyes under the dome with carved snowflakes. From the roof of the dome, clumps of snow abruptly flew down, hitting the platform powerfully. The guy, using stealth and stone skin, scuffled as he ran and dodged, saying that it wasn't snow that was falling, but real bombs. Hyun looked away and said that his skills were useless in such a case. The indignant guy doesn't notice something flying at him from the side. Suddenly, Ayun appears without even looking at him, indifferently kicks Hyun in the jaw and knocks him down. He clenched his teeth and flew to the side. The guy doesn't have time to react, and shards of stone skin fly off his face. The girl recoils and screams furiously that she believed him back then in the gym. And Yoon mercilessly attacks the guy with ice spears. She screams that she thought he wasn't like Lee, and the guy is pinned against the dome wall. A powerful ice lance hits the guy in the head, and the girl continues that she thought he wouldn't act in his best interest. The girl finally lost her temper, gathered a ball of energy in her hand, and shouted that after what she saw, she realized that it was all his own fault. And Yoon threw her energy ball with force, and at the place where it came in contact with the guy, a giant block of ice grew and caught the guy. The guy flew sideways like a cotton ball, splattering blood drops all around. The girl swung her hand again, and the block fell with a thunderous crash and broke into many pieces. The guy fell nearby and tried to get up, and the girl said that using skills without a license was illegal, and those two went to the hospital. And Yoon calmed down and quietly said that after all he'd done, she wouldn't report him, but she put a condition on it. Hyun is lying under a pile of snow and shivering, trying to get up but can't from his wounds, and the girl asked him to get out of the preliminaries. The girl keeps her eyes on the guy and keeps her hands up. She says he's not worthy of being a player. The girl's eyes rounded when she heard the guy ask who she was to say that and reprimanded her. Yun pulled himself together and with difficulty began to rise, swaying, rocks continuing to fly around the perimeter of the dome. The girl froze as the guy continued. She couldn't stop Lee Chang-jae's tyranny. How can she talk about strength, responsibility, and dignity? The guy straightened up and smugly smirked and said that it got to the point where it was easier for her to eliminate him, or better yet, admit her fear. And Yoon was taken aback, opened her mouth, and was speechless, because Hyun added that she was using the survival game as an excuse. The girl hesitated for a while, frustrated, and quietly said, "So that's what his answer was." And Yoon gathered herself. A light beam appeared in her hand, and she replied that there would be no indulgence in that case. The girl's eyes lit up and she became serious. A huge ice hammer appeared in her hand, which she holds with one hand. And Yoon said that she will kill Hyun with this hammer, and he, tired and wounded from the past battles swaying, begins to move. The guy thought about the fact that his stone skin had completely lost its strength after so many blows. Hyun tried to cover his hand with a stone, but it immediately crumbled. He was storming away from overexertion. He decided that he couldn't activate stealth either, as it would be dispelled by ranged attacks. The monk's characterization-enhancing heart is already active, but it's not enough to drastically change the situation. The hunt is still unavailable, and the guy doesn't have enough stamina to repeat that paralysis trick like he did with Lee Chang-jae. The guy quickly snapped out of his seat and ran at the girl already swinging her hammer and ready to counterattack. Hyun frowned and continues to move forward with a confident look. The girl with burning eyes swung around and waits for her opponent to come closer. Beams of light begin to shine through the ice ball. They begin to seep through the cracks after the battle inside the dome. There is an explosion, and the ice barrier explodes in different directions with huge blocks of ice. Those watching are stuck to the screen where the trial is being broadcast and can't understand what's even happening there. No one can get a good look. The manager also got excited, and the first person he thought of was Kim Tae-hyun, who was very worried about him and was watching the fight in a daze. The man rounded his eyes and looked questioningly at the screen, clearly surprised by something. The examiners stand at attention and watch carefully, their mouths open in amazement, asking what it is. The hovering platform is empty. In its center there is a huge hole with smoke coming from it. Shards of rocks and ice are flying in the hall. The fog clears, and on the edge of the broken platform, a guy lies on top of the girl, covering her with his body. Hyun lies on top of Ayun and kisses her, their fingers intertwined, while ice shards continue to fall around the platform. There was a spark between the couple, and the girl opened her eyes wide at what had happened. The guy pressed his lips tightly against hers. The girl was startled, and a drop of sweat rolled down her cheek. Her eyes blurred, and she mumbled in protest. And Yoon remembered the guy running towards her bleeding, and she swung her hammer to repel the attack. The girl grits her teeth, putting all her strength into the coming blow, her eyes burning. She is serious. And Yoon strikes her weapon, which has a block of ice formed on the top of it, on the platform, and it is brought upwards from the counterweight of the hilt. The girl looks carefully in the direction of the strike, and shards of ice and rocks fly at her. The high school girl abruptly lifts her head up and stares with surprised eyes with her mouth open. Hyun dodges the ice block, jumps up and flies at high speed at the girl from above with his arms spread out to the sides with an indifferent look. Looking at the guy's face, Ayun saw his worried look and his haste, because under the threat of death, he came to kiss at the last moment. The guy swooped down on the girl, grabbed her hand and kissed her. They start falling to the floor together. Despite how it looks from the outside, the guy used the paralysis skill to immobilize the girl. The couple's lips are pressed tightly against each other. Sweat drips off the girl, and she, straining, managed to bite the guy's lip until it bled. The guy intertwines his fingers with Ayun's fingers and uses a skill that affects the state at close range. When kissing, the skill penetrates inside the opponent and has a high chance of success. Hyun pinned the girl to the ground, put paralysis into his blood, and made the girl swallow it. The guy broke away from Ah-yoon's lips, but taking into account AE's rank's monstrous resistance, it's nothing more than a provocation. The young man pulled away from the girl who was lying motionless, his head turned to the side and being pierced by sparks of paralysis. The girl realized she was paralyzed. Resistance failed, but flushed from the kiss, and barely managed to mumble Hyun's name as she looked at him. The guy smiled contentedly and wiped away the blood with his hand. Miraculously, but his attack worked. He took psychological damage and his charm increased. The guy's attention was caught by something off to the side and he turned his head to look questioningly. There's a real commotion in the hall, and the announcer proclaims that from now on the first test is over and asks everyone to stay in their seats. The wreckage of the destroyed platforms continues to fall on the training ground, and the announcer added that the medical team will take everyone to safety. The first test is over, and everyone who is injured is immediately sent to the medics and receives first aid. Even though Ah-yoon was paralyzed, she still collected her badges and was competent in battle. Exam passed even though she lost in the battle with Hyun. Kim Dae-hyun, even though he only managed to collect 7 badges, but his victory over Shino and Ah-yoon brought him to everyone's attention. The guy walks confidently between the contestants and the screen with the exam results announced, with a smile on his face and putting his hand in his pocket. A few contestants gossip behind Hyun's back, saying that he's the one who defeated Shin and Ah-yoon. What tricks did he use since he only has a C rank? The guy stepped aside and looked admiringly at his hand, saying that the healing skills were just great. In that state, he couldn't even walk. Hyun thought he wanted the same skill. He would like to get one later, and hearing his name being called angrily, he shifted his gaze towards the sound. Shin, without waiting for the guy's answer, rushes at him in an attack, releasing discharges. But the guy covered with stone skin defends himself from the blow. The guy grouped himself, grabbed his opponent's fist with his hand covered with lightning, and said his name in surprise. Shin glares furiously at the guy and smiling says that now he won't be able to pull the same trick again, increasing the onslaught. Lightning flashed between the guys. They were blown away from each other and dust rose. The crowd of participants gathered and one said to watch, because there is a showdown. The guys realized that Shin wanted to take revenge. They happily started to support him, wanting him to get rid of Hyun and asking him to fry him. Shin cursed, told the fans that they don't decide anything, gave them a disdainful look, and pointed his finger in their direction, ready to launch a blast. The god of thunder ordered the screamers to shut up and hurled a bolt of lightning at them. The entire crowd received a powerful discharge and grunted with a shriek. Hyun smiled, looked at his opponent with a satisfied look and called him a crazy retard, and Shin offered to deal with him like men. His opponent lunged again, gathering lightning bolts in his palms and smiling said, "He'll prove Hyun is nothing without his damn tricks." A distraught Shin laughed loudly and changed in his face, his whole body being covered in lightning bolts. The guy looked at his opponent, surprised and questioning, slightly stepping back, the smile disappearing from his face. Suddenly gravity appeared and Shin was pinned to the floor so that he broke it with his body. Rocks started flying around. The opponent, pinned to the floor by gravity, couldn't move. He opened his mouth wide and grunted. Hyun also began to be pressed to the ground. He exhaled, but he is still holding on and looking suspiciously to the side. The announcer enters the waiting room and calls the guys rats. Everyone but Hyun lies pinned to the floor by gravity and grunts. A man walks past the guys lying on the floor and indignantly says they're not letting others enjoy their legitimate break. The guy under pressure is all sweaty, gritting his teeth, bulging his eyes, and thinking about the man. He is pierced by an unfamiliar impulse. The man stopped and said the guys dare to squeak, not knowing where they belonged, and started drawing a pattern in the air with 2 fingers. Hyun, also standing on his feet, resists and realizes that in front of him is S-ranked player Park Sang-jin, one of the best players in the association. The man is surprised and says with a smile that someone is still standing and stretches his hand forward, enveloped in black and gray energy. In Puck's hand appears a clot like a glass ball with a mixture of different energies, and there are small cracks on it. He clenched his teeth even tighter and bent down, the floor cracking beneath him as he began to lose his balance. Hyun looked at the man exhaustedly and thought he had heard that the skill level of the awakened and the players were different, but he didn't know it was that different. Park looked at the guy satisfactorily and asked with a surprised glint in his glasses, "How does the guy withstand the pressure, since even veterans can't handle it?" Testing the guy's strength, the man asked if he could withstand such a thing, and his orb in his hands began to distort the accumulated energies. The man was called by name and asked what he was doing. He turned around in surprise and the gravity began to weaken and the orb almost disappeared from his hand. Medics ran into the hall and seeing the kids lying there shouted, What is he doing to the kids who just left the doctors, or is he going to kill them? The medic grabs hold of Puck's arm and he starts to justify that he just wanted to scare them, but the medic didn't believe him and replied that it was a test of their skills. The guy gets up breathing heavily and the doctor is outraged that the man does this every preliminaries and threatens him that he'll report him to whoever needs to know. Puck cut the doctor short and turned to the guy asking what his name was. The guy looked at him questioningly. The young man introduced himself after a moment of hesitation. He couldn't catch his breath and was covered in sweat. The boy was still standing there. The man looked down at Hyun and wondered if this very ranked guy who defeated Shin Yunbak and Im Ma-yoon. Park smiled and thought that it had been a long time since he had been able to be so interested in anyone. The man clapped the guy on his shoulder much to his surprise and said that he obviously wanted to become an S-ranked player and asked if he was right. The examiner left with a smile, waving goodbye and said he would wait for the guy, which completely discouraged him. The boy remained standing looking at the man half-turned and confused. The medics noticed that Pak was leaving and ran after him, raising their fists, shouting in his wake where he was going and asking him to come back. All those who passed the first exam are gathered outside. Pak stands on a stage lit with magic circles. The gathered guys are puzzled why they were gathered here and are whispering, looking at the man. The examiner walked forward on the stage, and magic circles begin to be added behind him. The guys are hushed in anticipation. Puck, wearing glasses and a smile, picked up the microphone and asked if everyone had had time to rest, as the second round of player qualifiers would now begin. The guys cheered and stared at the man with their mouths open in surprise. Puck pointed to the circles and said that the essence of the challenge was behind the gate they would now pass through, and there was the Durank dungeon. The participants are dumbfounded by the news. They are frightened and ask if the dungeon is a dungeon with real monsters inside. The man continued that they will split into teams of 5 and explore the dungeon under the supervision of the player. Pak narrated that they will be evaluated for all activities inside the dungeon, namely combat, exploration, knowledge, medical, and emergency actions. The man noted that everything they need, such as weapons and ammunition, will be given by the association. The examiner invited everyone to take turns entering the gate in front of them, and Hyun thought with a chuckle that the second test would be the dungeon. Hyun smiled and thought that was smart enough. Even for newbies, there would be no problem since everyone would go in with current players. The guy frowned and thought that they might be sent to a double dungeon apocalypse. While exploring one of Durank's dungeons, a double dungeon with horrible monsters was discovered. Countless players, including the first group, died inside, and it caused a massive rifts to appear. The young man put his hands in his pockets and went first, thinking that it would be good if he could prevent it beforehand. The guy decides that no one will believe his words without confirmation and blame him for everything. He smiled and walked to the gate. He has his own business to take care of. Hyun thinks that as long as he is not a member of the first group, he will definitely be able to find a way to survive. Entering the gate, the guy stopped with a frustrated look. He sighed mentally and ironically thought that everything is great. The guy was greeted by a mustachioed player with glasses with the guys and pronounced that there were now 5 of them. The man smiled and motioned to move out, their player watching the second round in A-rank Ma Dohak. Hyun's spirits completely dropped as the man was the first dual dungeon apocalypse explorer. The first monsters they encountered were monsters that looked like thunderclouds with red eyes, only they were made of clay. The 4 of them rushed to counterattack at once, some with fire, some with wind, and some just defending themselves. The 4 of them quickly deal with the monsters using different skills. The player watching from the side shouted bravo and applauded loudly while clapping his hands. A man came out of the shadows and praised the guys, saying he was very impressed. The guys looked in his direction. The observer said, "Such determination in battle, considering this was their first such experience, and they are truly worthy of the title of players." Hyun, standing behind the guys, saw them get nervous and stated that it was all due to the player's instruction, and they did nothing. The guy glared at the others, glared at himself, and thought about why he was in the first research group out of all the teams. Hyun noticed the ring on the man's finger and thought that there was no doubt that the ring was a unique item and belonged to the first dungeon explorer. The Sage Ring increases strength, stamina, speed, and mana tenfold. The guy watching the group thinks that the apocalypse is definitely an AE's rank, and if the current Hyung is raked there, it's unlikely that he'll be able to survive it. Hyun gritted his teeth, furrowed his brows, and looked at the guys seriously. No matter how, he has a duty to get them out of the apocalypse. The group continued on their way, and what they saw ahead stunned them. They stopped. The guys stopped at a fork and wondered which of the 2 paths they should take. One participant quickly turned to the player and asked what they should do, and he put his fingers on his mustache and said that this happens all the time. The man raised one finger up, closed his eyes, and said that they should set up a vote, and at that moment Hyun abruptly ran past him. Hyun ran into one of the aisles. Pretending not to hear the player's exclamation, he stunned the entire group with his action. The player, covered in sweat, shouted that such rash actions were dangerous and ordered him to go back now, but the guy ignored him. Finally, the guy turned around, and with a happy smile replied that everything was fine. You can turn here, and he thought that it would be up to him to choose the path. The guy thought that there would be no voting and yelled run after him. He ran, and ahead was a gorge that he jumped through. Hyun thought he would make them go the other way and falls through the gorge. He keeps yelling to follow him, and the player calls out to him. The young man runs forward with a smile and thinks that he would rather die than let the group fall into the apocalypse, and finally the guys and the player follow him. The guy is happy that the group is following him. He's all sweaty from the fast movement and yells again that they're this way. Hyun runs until he came across another gate at the back of the dungeon and stopped with the group. The guy was surprised and froze. The others were also dumbfounded by the appearance of the gate. After all, it's impossible since they are inside the dungeon. The young man rounded his eyes and realized that this was the double dungeon. Apocalypse. He was paralyzed with horror. Hyun mentally cursed and stood in front of the gate, spreading his legs wide. He thought that he had wandered in vain for it to end like this. While the guy stands like a stumbling block, the masked participant offered to go and see what's there, stretching out his arm, moved past Hyun. The boy turned around and shouted at them to stand there and be afraid, and they asked him why he was shouting, but they stopped. The guy with a wild look shouted that at a glance it was obvious that this gate was very different from the one through which they had entered. Hyun got agitated and turned to the player, saying that the gate was too suspicious and that he should report it before doing anything, and asked if he was right. But he stood there emotionlessly, with his arms folded across his chest, thinking. The man looks at the gate carefully, raises his hand, hums, and says that, to tell the truth, this is the first time he has encountered such a thing, and if the rules are to be followed, they should wait for further instructions. The guy exhaled in relief as he stood with his back to the gate, smiled, and looked at the player gratefully. When the man spoke again, the lad's eyes rounded and he panicked in surprise, looking at the older of the group. The player smiled, his eyes lit up, and he raised his index finger, pointed to the side, and said that this time they would do it their way. The guy turned around following the player passing by and tried to reason with the older man, but he waved him off as he passed by with a smile and said he understood what candidate Hyun was trying to say. The man touched the gate with his fingertips and said that aside from their appearance, the amount of mana inside the gate is not dangerous. Besides, they are in a day-ranked dungeon, and if something happens, that a ranked player will stay with them. The player turned around with burning eyes and said, while raising a finger upwards, that regardless of who prepared these gates or where they came from, this kind of research would definitely add extra points to them. Hyun looks at the player with fear-crazed eyes and says that Ma Do-hak has lost his mind, because there are rules to researching the abyss, but missteps, so the player interrupts him. The man turns around abruptly and smugly, laughing at the guy's words. The player raises his hand and points his finger at the guy and asks if he should listen to this from a participant who can't even act in a team. He answered with a dumbfounded look, clenching his fists, and the guys remained standing aside. Finally, the participants entered the conversation. The girl supported the player said, taking a step forward, that he himself, like a stung, carried forward. The second picked up, closing his eyes, that the guy should know his place, even if he has some skills. After the third said that he couldn't believe that Hyun was arguing with a current player and asked him if he was too arrogant. The guy got angry, frowned, and involuntarily growled, thinking about the guys that they were stupid. The contestants bypassed the guy and stood next to the player, standing with their backs to the gate that looked like a whirlpool. The man said it was settled. All 5 of them looked disapprovingly at Hyun. 2 of them stood in a fighting stance. The guy stretched out his hand and shouted, drenched in sweat, and looking at them with wild eyes, told Ma Do-hak to stop and think again. The man snapped his fingers without looking at the boy, and an electric shock appeared between his thumb and forefinger. The boy stares at the gate in bewilderment, and his eyes get bigger and bigger. His face floods with light. The boy faces the gate and sees it change color, gradually turning into a black and white blob, and in its background stand 5 of his group, including the player, who still stands with his hand raised. After the click, the guy froze in place with his legs spread wide, and the blob took on the image of a huge eye that stares intently at the researchers, as if drawing them in. There was a blinding flash, a thud, and the cave disappeared. The whole group of 6 found themselves in a huge corridor with many white columns, and behind them is a red space. At the end of the hall stands something like a statue, and above his head glowing halo in the form of a crown. Hyun stands in front and looks toward the end of the hallway, but his attention is drawn to the space behind the white columns with flying stones next to it. Dust rises from the statue at the end of the hall and a cold smell wafts from it. It looks like a skeleton with its head covered in an old worn rag, its hands folded together and resting on a sword that stands in front of it. And behind the statue is a black circle in a red space. Getting closer, the group was able to see that the statue has a flower-shaped emblem on its chest, a lean body, handcuffs on its arms, a halo shining on its head in the form of a rim with spikes and a ball in the center, and cracks on its cloak can be seen. The guys are looking at the hall. The girl looks away in surprise. One of the guys stammering asks the player if he's sure this is a DE rank dungeon and what the hell is going on here. The man stares dumbfoundedly ahead and he blacks himself. The guy standing with his back to the group in front of a large and thick cloud of dust mixed with pebbles ordered them to shut up and look forward, to which the man grudgingly cursed and said that the guy kept being rude. The guy's face covered with sweat and he kept his eyes on the hall, frowning his eyebrows and said they were coming. From the dust cloud appeared two silhouettes with burning eyes and glowing halos. Ringing armor, they are heading towards the group, which gathered at one point and watching the opponents. Two knights emerged from the thick of the dust looking like ghosts. Instead of a belly, they have an empty space in which there are magical crystals. One holds a huge sword in his hand, the other holds a spear. Their faces are covered with cloth and pressed by rims. A rank. A Death Knight's come out to the group and the player bulged his eyes and asked where they came from and stood there like a dumbfounded man. The participants screamed in panic but did not pull away or scatter. The man froze with horror. He was dumbfounded by what was happening. Panic was written on his face. He was covered with sweat and frowned his eyebrows, looking with eyes full of hopelessness. The player sharply turned around and waved his hand, loudly ordered everyone to prepare for battle, and himself does not take his eyes off the knights, frightened participants as if grown into the ground. The enemy rushed into battle first, ringing rusty iron. One swung his spear and the other drew his sword to his chest to attack. The knights simultaneously struck where the team stood, and there was a ringing sound of blades hitting the floors, raising dust and stones into the air, taking their guns behind their backs. They crossed with the rumbling sound of metal. The team scattered, shouting loudly and dodging attacks with light beams. A girl crouched down defending herself with her hands against flying stones. Two were cut off by the leader of the group who was running forward with a frantic face. The player stopped and called the opponents nasty monsters, put his hands together and opened his palms to create magical seals. Energy began to gather between his fingers. Fiery lava appeared under the feet of the opponents and they began to sink slowly in it. One of the knights is leaning on a spear and the second does not move. The man crossed his arms and his seal increased in size and sharp stakes flew out of the lava and pierced through the opponents, lifting them above the floors. From this, the rift increases and the crack went under the feet of the leader. Both monsters, pierced through by the lava wedges, roared, cracks forming around their wounds. The player gives the order to attack now, all at once. Guys stood in line with the mentor and began to hit with their skills, shouting loudly. The damage inflicted by the man cheered up the participants, and they confidently went into battle. The leader gave the order to blind the opponents and give them maximum flashes and fire. The girl with the fire blades and the guy with the light beam rushed first, gritting their teeth and looking confidently forward. The rest of the candidates, the leader orders to defend the attackers and not let the monsters attack, continuing the offensive, and two guys rushed to fulfill the order, one with a stone shield, the other with streams of air. The team continues to hit with everything they can. The leader has a seal in front of his hands that has increased in size and is holding back the monsters by penetrating them with wedges. One of the knights breaks the wedges with his spear and points it at the guys. Hyun stands aside at this time. Under the combined onslaught, the knights fall to the ground with a clatter, breaking through the ground. The man approaches the defeated monsters to check on them. Two lights continue to blaze on his fingertips, and the guys, catching their breath, decide to come closer. The girl looked at the enemies in surprise and whispered that they were saved. After all, no one thought that there would be a rank monsters. The guy standing next to him laughed merrily, boasted that he did not even sweat and is ready to fight them again. Just when the guy said that he would like to repeat the fight, he raised his arm victoriously and laughed as the silhouette of another knight covered in thick dust appeared behind him, and he clanked his metal on the floor. Standing in the dust and flying stones, the whole group turned around at the noise and stunned in amazement. Opening their mouths, they look in the direction of the noise and freeze in place. 4 more knights with other halos and weapons emerged from the dust to replace the 2 defeated ones, clanking on the floor with metal shoes, mace, sickle, and bayonet. They resemble the previous ones with their bodies. The enemy approaches with a steady stride, heading straight for the team, raising dust and rocks into the air. All the knights are distinguished by their halo, weapons, and chest designs, but all have half-empty bodies with a magic stone in the middle and closed faces. The team, seeing the new opponents, were frightened. The guy opened his mouth and covered in sweat. The other masked one bulged his eyes, and the dumbfounded leader stunned at what was happening. Hyun approached one of the defeated monsters and looked closely at its stomach. The monster was not only much stronger than a normal monster, but was also 3 times taller than the people present. A shadow fell on the guy's face, and he realized that something was definitely wrong. Sliding his hand into the monster's belly, he rounded his eyes in puzzlement. The player is standing among many broken knights on half-bent legs, their body parts lying separately, various weapons stuck in the floors which are covered with cracks. A man stares forward in tension. Fear reads in his eyes, and he is covered in drops of blood, breathing heavily. The player is wounded and mentally grumbles, realizing that every time they gain the upper hand, their numbers only grow. He sees a whole crowd of monsters coming out of the end of the hall. The man turns around, sweat dripping down his cheek, and he looks at the research participants. He knows that his team is very tired and wounded as much as he is. The opponents are getting more and more, and the guys are on the verge. This thought does not give rest to the player. He thinks that at this rate they are all going to die here. From the side of the destroyed monsters comes out Hyun and turns to the player, saying that something strange is happening here. The man and the researchers looked at the guy, surprised. The guy with a confident gait approached the group. He is stained with blood and dirt, one of his hands clenched into a fist. The player stands up with his legs spread wide and looks at the guy in surprise, thinking, who the hell is this guy? Because he looks awake even after so many battles, and was the first to realize that this gate is dangerous. The player realizes that it's only because of the monarch's heart that their characteristics are so high, otherwise they wouldn't have lasted this long. The man hesitated if Hyun was really an awakened rank C, still dousing himself in sweat and looking at the guy with bewilderment. He asked what he meant by strange. The guy turned around, looked at the approaching enemies, and replied that it was just a guess, but maybe they weren't Death Knights, which surprised the player. The team's eyes bulged and stammered with glee and shouted, "What the hell is this nonsense? Then what have they been fighting all this time?" The guy turned around and walked over to one of the swords stuck in the floor and took hold of the hilt, saying that's what he was going to find out, while the group stood behind in bewilderment and asked him what he was going to do. Hyun covered his hand with stone skin, gripped the hilt tighter, and pulled the sword from the ground in a sharp motion. The guy instantly single-handedly rushed to attack the monsters running at him, swinging the huge and heavy sword, many stones flying from underneath. Hyun swung his sword straight at the monsters, and they thrust their weapons forward with a loud clang of metal. Swords, axes, bayonets, and many other varieties of weapons are aimed at the guy. The knights simultaneously attacked and brought their weapons down on the place where the guy had just been. The impact made a flash and a deafening sound. Rocks and dust flew everywhere. One monster shook its head and roared, looking in the direction of the attack, leaning forward sharply. The dust scattered, and the monsters did not raise their lowered weapons. There was a dent left on the floor from the attack, but the guy was no longer there. The monsters leaned forward and studied the site of the attack, but the guy had dodged and was already leaping over them from above, not letting go of the sword he had picked up. The knights raised their heads up, raising their weapons as the guy flew over them. The guy grits his teeth and swings his sword with all his might, cutting through the air, glaring angrily at the knights. Hyun throws the sword with all his might at the statue they saw when they entered this hall, and it flies at great speed right into the center. Behind the statue is a black halo, and the space resembles a red eye. Cutting through the air, the weapon goes at breakneck speed straight for the statue's head. The guy's plan succeeds, and the weapon hits the target, and a crack appears on the statue. After hitting the neck of the statue, its head flies off and splits into many shards, and the sword flies into the space behind the destroyed sculpture. Before he even lands, the guy, drenched in sweat and rounded eyes, feels behind him the knights, who rushed after him in pursuit, after his maneuvered escape and swing their weapons. A bright flash erupted, and the monsters, before they could reach Hyun, began to gradually dissipate. Everything around began to dissipate. The illusion fell after the destruction of the statue, and even the weapon that was stuck in the ground appears the outline of an ordinary cave. The outline of the tiled floor under the haze begins to disappear, and the regular cave stone appears. The group stands in the center of the disappearing hall and the falling stones, somehow staying on their feet and looking surprised at what is happening and asking what is going on. not believing that it was all an illusion. Hyun answered the question and said it was an illusion trap, and the whole team turned in his direction with their mouths open in bewilderment. The guy walked towards the group and said that they were seeing an imaginary place with imaginary enemies, using it to take away the powers of everyone who entered the gate. Behind Hyun's back, the vision began to distort, and the image of the hall became blurry. The narrow-eyed guy shouted indignantly that this cannot be, whether they fought hard because of an illusion, and the girl, rounded eyes stammering, asked if further they are waiting for something worse. The player nervously turned to the guy by name and, drenched in sweat, asked how he knew about this trap, because he had yet to meet with the Death Knights. Then how the hell did he know? The guy turned his head to leave and put his hands in his pockets and said that he didn't know much about them. Hyun turned some more and added with a confident expression that they were definitely not that weak. The man was taken aback by the answer. He opened his eyes in shock, furrowed his eyebrows, and opened his mouth. There was no trace of his former self-confidence left. The guy turned around and walked forward. Without turning around, he waved his hand. He suggested moving on before that place became their mass grave, leaving the team confused. The group listens to the guy's advice and they move on. The player went forward, lighting the way for the team with his ring. The rest of the team follows cautiously. Hyun helps the girl, who is exhausted after the battle. Hyun has an uneasy feeling. He thinks that the Morocco has disappeared, but it hasn't gotten better, and continues to walk forward, lighting the way and looking into the depths of the cave. The guy also noticed that after the appearance of the apocalypse, the space of the dungeon has changed. The wounds received in the battle with the false knights have only gotten worse. The team is moving in agony, and the girl has lost consciousness at all. Hyun clenched his teeth and, covered with sweat, drags her on himself so that they could not just wait for help. The player continues to shine, and the team's only hope is to find a way out of this dungeon. That is the gate. Finally, the group stops and everyone looks up with surprised eyes. Hyun wants to say something, but the words are stuck on his tongue. Instead, the player says, holding his glowing hand in front of him, that they have found. The group approaches a huge door. Light shines through the cracks, and the player says that the exit is right behind them. The guys look at the doors in surprise, and one asks if this isn't dangerous. And the player looked up with a frowning brow, but confidently replied that perhaps there is danger. The man's gaze deepened, and he noted, if they don't go through the doors, they will surely die here. The door with a creak begins to open, and a bright light shines through the resulting gap. The man pushes the door open with both hands, pushing it open wider and wider, a drop of sweat dripping down his forehead, and he stares earnestly ahead. The player's face changes to one of amazement, and he freezes, but the door continues to creak open slowly, and the man's eyes fill with terror. The doors creak fully open, the skulls are carved on them, and they are visible only with sufficient light. The whole group froze on the threshold, seeing the night killer in the corridor. He stands on one knee, leaning on his sword, and bowing his head. The assassin knight stands in a gloomy haze, kneeling on one knee and bowing his head, which is covered by a cloth, his sword glistening and leaning on it, a halo glowing behind his back. The masked guy stands holding one hand on the shoulder of the other hand and asks if this is the Death Knight. The other, with a shadow on his face, laughed doomedly and cheered that he is only one here. There was a sound of iron striking. The monster starts to rise without raising his head and leaning on his sword. 10 more Death Knights start to appear behind him, his magic stone inside shining. From what they saw, the whole team opened their mouths in bewilderment and stood in a stupor. Their eyes widened involuntarily from shock. Only the girl continues to hang on Hyun's shoulders. On the walls along the corridor appear skulls with open mouths, spewing flames, and making a characteristic sound. Fire-breathing skulls also appear from floor to ceiling, filling the walls of the corridor. In the next instant, 6 more full knights appear with identical halos and swords in their hands, and flames erupt in front of them. Torches gradually light up the entire hall from floor to ceiling, illuminating the contents of the walls where knights with glowing halos stand in several rows tightly together, and a variety of weapons hang from the ceiling. The team led by the player enters the hall and finds themselves surrounded by countless assassin knights. They are everywhere. On the ground and on the walls of the hall, they are loudly ringing their iron armor. The guys shook with horror. They look around dumbfounded, do not understand what is happening, and do not believe their eyes that all these are Death Knights. A shadow fell on their faces. The biggest surprise was when the team heard laughter, and raising their heads, they saw that the walls had slid apart, and there was a staircase at the end of which sat on a throne another knight who said that weak people were able to go all the way. The knight said so be it, his red eyes looking down, Instead of a face, he had a bare skull. His neck was shrouded in a bright light, and on his head a headband lit up in a circle. Other skulls could be seen behind his face. Sitting on his throne, the knight has his hands folded in his lap. His armor is different from his previous opponents. The helmet is carved with skulls and covered in spikes, the monster spoke out. Let the battle begin, for he is the boss of the double gates of the apocalypse. The head of the Death Knights, the AE's rank monster, announced the start of the battle, and the surrounding monsters banged their swords on the floor, signaling that the order was accepted. The knights bang their swords repeatedly on the floor, and pebbles begin to fly off of it. There is a loud noise of iron hitting the ground. Clanking metal, several knights come forward, raising their swords, their magic stones glowing brightly. The enemy comes closer to the team and swings his sword, showing that he is ready for battle, while the group stands at a loss, only Hyun and the player standing with their shoulders squarely on the ground. The group panicked, looking at the knight, and one of the guys stammering asks what's going on and what they want from them. Hyun, holding the girl on his shoulders, took a step back and looked forward, suggesting that it looks like a challenge to a one-on-one duel. The guys were completely confused when they heard about the duel, exhausted and dirty. They are covered in sweat. The masked boy raised his head up in doom and looked with eyes full of terror, and the other one shouted that he couldn't do it because he had no mana left. Hyun sighed, pulled himself together, continued to hold the girl, turned his head to the guys, and smiling said that they should calm down because their goal was to avoid the battle, not to get involved in it. The three guys in the group were frightened and rushed back into the dungeon, leaving the leader, Hyun, and the girl alone, which discouraged the rest of the group. As they ran away, one of them cried and said that it was better to go back to the place where they had started, while the other ran stammering, repeating several times that he didn't want to die. Suddenly, one of the knights starts to attack. Flashing his sword, he bends and swings. The knight swings his sword, and a beam of light appears from the sword, which flew towards the fleeing knights. The leader and Hyun jump aside to dodge, and the fleeing knights don't see the attack. The light beam hits the fleeing guys and hits them in the backs. One of the guys opened his eyes in surprise, coughing, and a clot of blood flew out of his mouth. The guy screamed in pain as he continued to cough up blood and started to fall, blood splattering everywhere. The leader recoiled with his eyes bulging from what he saw and raised his hands in disbelief. Hyun, not letting the girl out of his arms, dumbfounded, watching what was happening. Drops of blood from a powerful light strike reached them. Hyun is confused and can't utter a word. He stares at the guys dumbfounded, and drops of their blood get on his face. Finally, the guy pulls himself together, turns sharply to the player, and shouting to him by name says that he will distract them and buy some time. The man turned to the knight and looked at him, frowning his eyebrows. The guy continues to yell with crazy eyes for the player to find a way out. But at that moment, a blob of light flies towards his face, splitting the air. The man throws Hyun and the girl back with the air wave and is left alone in front of the opponents. Looking carefully inside and not looking at the thrown guys, the guy falls directly on the girl with all his weight. The player prepares to counterattack. Putting his hand forward, he let out tongues of flame and formed a triangular seal. The guy stood up, raised his arm protecting his chest, and sat on the ground, a stone wall between him and the active players blocking the entrance to the hall. Hyun tried to get up quickly, but falls on one knee, leaning his hand on the ground, and seriously asks the player what the hell he is doing, and the girl is lying unconscious next to the guy. The man turns his head slightly. The veins on his cheeks and neck are swollen. Sweat rolls down his cheekbones. He shouts and spits and orders the guy to keep quiet because he is only an awakened man, so he should know his place and keep his head down. The dust behind the guy understands. He looks surprised and questioning at the player. He finally manages to get up. A raised wall separated the player and the guy and the girl, and the player bowed his head and confessed that he had always wished to become a ranked player. The man continued without turning around, standing under the falling stones from the wall, that no matter what he does, no matter how he develops his skills, in the end he is not getting closer to the goal, but only moving farther and farther away from it. The guy is taken aback by the player's words and stares at the wall with astonished eyes and mouth ajar. The man explains that this was his chance. If he could do it, he could get closer to the goal. The man twitched his shoulder and added with a bitter laugh that this was what his choice had led to. At the player at great speed, cutting through the air, headed for the opponent, swinging a sword that turns into a light whip. The man stands idly, only clenching his fists. Finally, the man gathers himself, and with 2 fingers he draws a new seal. With his other hand, he wraps his other hand around it and lets the energy flow around the seal. The player attacked in advance, putting 1 foot forward, He successfully released two beams of light that flew cross to cross and struck the opponent, separating his sword arm from his torso. The man shouted to Hyun without turning around that he was different, and he was sorry to admit it, but he had great potential. Two more knights with different weapons were already bearing down on the player, and he shouted for the guy to run away, taking the survivors with him, and to get as far away from here as possible. The man put his hands forward, tensed up, and on his face only glittered his glasses. He said that it was his duty as a senior to protect the candidates from danger. The player gathered all his strength into a stronger seal. His whole body glowed, his gaze became confident and fierce. He shouted to the guy that he would stop the opponents. Hyun said the player's name and stared at the wall the man was fighting alone behind. He was discouraged by this behavior of the player. The guy quickly turned around and looked at the unconscious girl lying on the ground and clenched his fists. The sounds of a furious battle can be heard behind the wall. The injured girl lies on the ground, barely breathing, and does not regain consciousness for quite some time. Suddenly, the guy's face changes, his eyes rounded, his whole face covered with sweat from horror, and he looks nowhere with a lost look. The guy freezes, staring ahead with a stunned look. His hands unclench, and behind him there is an explosion. Fervor and huge rocks fly in different directions, and the wall is destroyed. Hyun finally turns around sharply and covers his chest with his hand defensively. Clenching his teeth, he stares dumbfoundedly in the direction of the once-grown wall, and from there his face is illuminated by a bright light. The lad sees his mentor lying unconscious face down in a pile of rocks and dust. His glasses lying next to him, and a crowd of knights standing over him, and one of them holding the sword he used to pierce the player. The wounded man is lying on his stomach under the rubble of stones. A purple fire is burning in the place where the sword was thrust in. His broken glasses with shattered glasses are lying next to his head. The man's face was pressed into the ground, and the knights moved on, passing him. The guy felt as if he was paralyzed. He stood up like a stooped man looking at the knights with huge eyes. The sounds of clanking metal coming closer. The image of an unconscious wounded girl lying on the ground nearby popped up in Hyun's mind. The guy sees the breathless body of the player who tried so desperately to protect him. The enemy slowly approaches, and the guy all stares at them with a disconsolate look, eyes wide open, his face in sweat, and a shadow has appeared under his lower eyelid. The knight raises his sword, from the tip of which drips the blood of the defeated player. One of the Death Knights stretched his arm forward, his blade shining with different shades of purple color, and pointed at the guy's head. He makes it clear that he's challenging him to a duel. Such an action puzzled the guy. Hyun thought about the injured girl lying on the ground in the dust with her head turned away from him. She was being attacked by rocks. The incumbent player was hurt the most. He's still lying motionless with his face ducked to the ground and broken glasses beside him. The guy stands looking at the group of knights, and the one who challenges him to a duel with his sword extended in his direction, and notices that there is a splinter from a weapon that belonged to one of the monsters next to him. The Death Knight waits for the guy's decision and doesn't move from his seat, still holding his arm outstretched. A breeze blows over him, and his halo and rim glow. Hyun stares at his opponent's sword without moving and looks at him disconsolately. As a drop of the player's blood runs down the blade, the guy bleeding with sweat. There is a quiet sliding of metal, and the guy questioningly and surprised looks from the blade to the ground. He saw something incredible. From the sword of the enemy to the ground, gleaming falls a ring that belonged to the current player. A rare artifact, which by pure chance was on the tip of the blade of the Death Knight. The ring fell in the area between Hyun and the knight between small stones, and its red stone glistens in the light. The boy presents the image of a smiling player with his hand raised in a fist, the ring on his index finger, and Hyun keeps his eyes on it with his teeth clenched. Without waiting for a response, the knight swings his sword at him, and electrical discharges sparkle from his wristbands. The enemy starts to attack. The guy looks at the ring, and his eyes reflect the attacking knight. The enemy forcefully hits the place where the boy was standing, but he managed to dodge and rushed away. The young man dodges and picks up a ring from the ground, twisting it between his fingers, thinking it's his only chance to get out of here alive. Hyun hurriedly tries to put the ring on his finger, clenching his teeth and looking at it carefully. It glows before it touches the boy's skin, asking him to wake up. The boy puts the ring on his index finger, and the ring is pierced with needles, and the stone glows with a scarlet light. Hyun finds himself surrounded by Death Knights. They swing their weapons at the same time, and the guy putting the ring on his finger starts to be covered with red-black discharges. As if time stopped and the knights froze, from the guy went destructive waves, and he was covered with a powerful white aura. In all directions flew discharges of lightning striking the opponents. The knight sitting on the throne looked at what was happening, surprised and questioned. From his gait came a violet energy refreshing his skull. In the hall, the light changed to red, and the guy starts fighting several knights at the same time, releasing spiky vines around him. The enemies attack and fly away from the guy like a toy together, knocking rocks out of the ground. The Apocalypse boss opened his mouth and asked in surprise with flashing eyes, "What kind of power is this?" The guy wore a sage ring that glows brightly, and all his characteristics increased by 10 units. With light movements of his hand, he destroys one enemy after another. It is scattered into small pieces from his attacks. Hyun is covered with the energy of hunting because all the conditions are met, and the skill restriction is removed and the guy's eye once again glowed red. The unconscious girl and player continue to lie at the opened gate. Several weapons are stuck in the ground, and several destroyed opponents are lying around, and a red glow is visible from the gate. From the depths of the hall come the sounds of battle, and in places sparkles from the impact of weapons. The boy leans forward, releases his hunting harness, and hits the ground with such force that explosions erupt and the opponents fly apart, while he makes his way to the Apocalypse boss sitting on the throne. Hyun was rattled and more knights attacked from above. The boy turned around and clenched his teeth tightly, his body enveloped by discharges. The young man sensed the enemies approaching and thrust his arm out in their direction, releasing more spiky vines. He focused on the enemies with his burning eye, which left a plume of red thread as he turned around. The guy grabs one of the opponent's swords and rushes towards the boss, fending off the foes with his slings. Hyun sees the effect of hunting on the enemies. Their halos and bezels begin to dissolve under the effect of his skill, and he thought it would take him 10 seconds to fully absorb using hunting. The young man thought that he can't depend only on hunting and releases the energy into the sword he holds in his hand. His hand and weapon are covered with stone skin. The guy notices the enemies approaching from all sides and directs his vines directly at the magical stones in the monster's bellies. He deftly attacks each opponent and connects all the skills and every unit of stats he has acquired to the battle. Hyun destroys the knights one by one and makes it a point to use every last bit of it. The boy gets so excited that he starts to slash his opponents left and right, not giving them a chance to get close to him. The young man is once again surrounded by knights and watches each one carefully. He is girded with his energy and swings his sword at those closest to him. One of the knights managed to evade the attack and points his sword at the guy. The guy gritted his teeth and looked at him with a fierce look and thought that only then he can survive this, when he uses everything he knows. A crushing blow fell on the floor. There was an explosion. Parts of the knight's armor mixed with stones flew in different directions. A thick column of dust rose, punctuated by discharges of enemy energy. The noise of flying and falling stones is heard in the hall. The dust has risen so much that the view became zero. The dust begins to disperse and the guy sees a huge spear covered with discharges and sparks pierced one of the knights. He does not understand what is happening and sits on the ground leaning on his elbows. The young man looked at the spear, which was shining and sparkling. He opened his eyes in surprise and asked what the hell it was. The boy heard a strange sound that did not bode well. His face contorted a grimace of horror and he clenched his teeth covered with sweat. The young man was in the rear of the enemy fighting alone, saw the boss of the Apocalypse rise from his throne, and from him emanates a terrifying energy. The guy shuddered. The Death Knight stands with his arm outstretched forward and clearly not happy with what is happening. Energy is shooting out from all parts of his body and flying around. The guy is horrified. He grunts, curses, and looks forward with a look of hopelessness as the S-rank monster enters the battle. The previously hanging weapon from the ceiling shone and flew down at once straight at Hyun. He turned and looked up stunned. The guy deftly dodged the falling blades with clenched teeth and a frightened look. And behind him, there was another rumble of thunder and dust, with rocks flying in different directions. He turns around and dodges with clenched teeth, noticing that the flying weapons start to change direction and hit the perimeter he is in. As he continues his escape, Hyun doesn't notice the sparks from his opponent's energy reaching his leg. Various weapons sprinkled throughout the hall, coloring the floor purple, and the knight stands at the top of the stairs at his throne. The boy breaks out of the attack zone screaming and stretches his arm forward, shrouded in a black and red aura, exhaling heavily. The young man reaches the stairs leading to the throne and directs his hunt at the Apocalypse boss, who stands unmoving. The Death Knight stretches out his arm in response and with burning eyes stops the hunt in one motion. A blob of energy appears in the boss's palm, and he directs it at the hunting guy to counteract it and deactivate it. An electrical discharge leaps through and coalesces into the shape of a jagged five-pointed star. The Death Knight held his hand out to the side and a huge spear appeared, and the hunt disintegrated into small, fiery shreds. The guy with his skill was thrown back and shreds of his energy followed. He stared at the boss in astonishment with his arms stretched forward. Hyun opened his eyes even wider. and was surprised when the Apocalypse boss said that he was strong. However, this was his limit. The Death Knight looked at Hyun from under his brow, and one of his eyes begins to emit red fire against his purple aura. Once again, an explosion even more powerful than the previous one goes off in the hall, rocks and dust flying everywhere, and a purple pillar of light appears in the center of the impact. The dust begins to settle and develop, revealing many shining purple blades stuck into the ground. The knight descended the steps and stabbed the lying young man with his huge spear covered in energy and stepped on his head. The boss in shining armor looked down at the guy and asked him to answer his last question. The guy lies on the ground with his mouth open, and the opponent pins him with his foot and asks him who gave him the power. An ominous aura appears in the hall, and the Knight of the Apocalypse pushes the guy harder. He screams to the entire hall. The mysterious force countered the roar of the King of Knights. The resistance partially succeeded. Sparks bounce off Hyun, and he exhaled. Looking down at the young man from above, the knight said he knew it. Unlike the others, the guy understands their language. The Apocalypse boss is all glowing. A haze comes out of his gate, and he looks at the lad with red, burning eyes and asks him to tell what his power is. The young man continues to be pierced by electric shocks, coughs up blood, and starts screaming again. Hyun finds himself in an unknown space, huge stone beams sticking into the ground everywhere. The boy stands on the water, and a multi-armed, horned, and faceless monster appears in front of him. The monster stands with his head slightly pulled back, and a dark haze begins to emanate from him. Rocks fall around him, leaving circles on the water. Asmodeus's eyes are faded. Small stones fall on him from above, and he is inactive. His chest is bandaged, and instead of ribs, his chest is filled with skulls. The guy stands in front of the monster and stares at it with a calm face. Something caught the guy's attention, and he turned his head sharply to the side. Hyun saw the members of his group unconsciously lying on the water with clenched fists. The young man took a closer look at the injured body of the current player. He lay with his eyes closed and his mouth ajar. A Death Knight appears behind the guy's back, glowing with black discharges, and slowly descends on the water. His cloak evolves, and the collar shines with purple light. The guy freezes with eyes wide open in surprise and thought that nothing has changed. The wounded guy bowed his head slightly and gloomed, thinking what exactly is hunting, and why he, being a human, can understand monsters. The Apocalypse boss held out a sword covered in dark energy this time and looked at the boy with one eye, and Hyun thought that if you exclude everything else, he was only given strength and chance, but nothing changed. Leaning over, the knight swung his sword and pointed it at the boy's neck, and the boy grew more and more gloomy and did not raise his head, wondering why and wherefore the king had given him this power. The boy's eyes opened in surprise, his face lit up with a bright light, and he heard a voice that said confidently that he had already explained it. A bright light shone in the space in front of the guy, and out of it came the king. His long hair easily developed in the wind, and transparent drops of water began to rise into the air. The guy stood up like a stumbling block. Coming closer, a lock of hair fell on the king's face. The man explains that he was attracted by the guy's persistence and determination. The lad looks at the king silently in puzzlement and surprise. A drop of sweat runs down his face, and the man says that the lad doesn't need to change and should just go forward. Lying under the pressure of the monster's leg, the lad's strength shot through, and he opened his reddened eyes wide and looked away with a furious stare, continuing to emit dark electric discharges and pressing his foot against the guy who was wounded and lying in a cloud of dust. The monster suggested that he no longer had the strength left to respond. Calling the guy a pathetic person, the knight glared at him with a despicable look and swung his weapon, covered in black aura. Just when the Apocalypse boss said that it was the end for the guy, a cracking sound was heard, and the eyes on the monster's skull took on a surprised expression. From the guy's side, spiky wires flew in several directions, destroying everything around and reaching for the monster. Dust rising into the air, rocks flying, and scattered weapons of other knights. Energy vines start hitting the monsters around, and they fall one by one under the onslaught of the guy's powerful blows. The armor and weapons of the affected monsters are flying in different directions. The spiked wires have increased in size, and the affected area is getting wider. The Death Knight looked at what was happening and asks what is going on. The light in the hall changed. An air wave rises. The boy got out from under the knight's foot and put both hands on the ground, spreading his entanglements. A red aura appeared around himself, and the knight laughed loudly and called Hyun a lowlife and asked if he was going to continue like this. The young man's body pulsed with multicolored energy, and he screamed, his mana stats starting to increase. The knight opened his mouth and laughed gloatingly, smugly adding, looking at the boy with red eyes, that this was his last battle. The monster tore towards the guy and asked if he wanted to entertain him to the very end and swung his weapon. And the guy, without moving from his seat, is covered with his entanglements like a cloak. At great speed, the sword comes at the guy, cutting through the air with a distinctive sound. He's covered in energy and is pierced by electrical discharges. The Apocalypse boss jumps up and strikes a crushing blow. From such an attack, the earth splits, stone boulders fly in different directions, and up rises a column of light penetrated by black discharges. The knight is in a leap, carefully watching the place he hit, his face illuminated by violet light and piercing discharges. The monster sharpened his attention and opened his mouth. There was a quiet noise which alerted the knight. The guy, without raising his eyes, asked, wondering what his power was, and repelled the blow of the opponent with one hand. Bending it at the elbow above his head, it is completely enveloped in his energy. The knight's pupils narrowed in surprise, and he recoiled from the guy, not believing his eyes. The young man shouted and offered his opponent to feel his power on himself. The guy's eye lit up with red light, and he gathered energy in his hand. New spiky vines started to emerge from it. Hyun reaches the BAE rank, and at that moment he jumps up, gathering all his strength together, and strikes the enemy with a crushing black and red discharge, causing the monster and the objects around it to fly upwards, leaving behind a dark plume. As the knight moves away from the guy after the powerful blow, he grunts with his mouth wide open and keeps his eyes on the young man as he continues to be pursued by the spiky vines. After hitting his opponent, the lad returns to the ground, watching as he continues to fly upwards, accompanied by his spiked vines, and begins to reach for the weapon flying past. The young man grabs the weapon and lets his slings pass around his arm. He swings his serrated sword and looks fiercely at his foe with lighted eyes. The boy jumps up lightning fast and starts attacking the enemy with the picked-up weapon. He dodges and defends himself with his energy. He still manages to catch up with the enemy, and he strikes him right in the skull. A lot of powerful blows the guy struck the enemy, and he roared and opened his mouth wide, asking how he dares. And surrounded by rays after the attacks, the skull of the enemy begins to be covered with cracks. A variety of thrown weapons flashed in the air and hovered, changing their direction. The guy floats in the air and his weapon breaks into 3 pieces, and the knight stretches out his arm in his direction, pointing many blades at the guy and shouting that a weakling like him dare not resist. The lad flies back along with the stones and lowers his head and raises his hand covered with hunting. The young man clenches his fist sharply, and the spiky vines begin to envelop his arm in a circle. At high speed, the spiked vines fly towards the enemy, cleaving the air. Suddenly, the spiky vines transform into a liquid-like state and spread in the air. The guy spirals the liquid paths, and they combine to form a fanged monster that heads towards the enemy, with an open maw to devour him. And the enemy flies back down toward the ground. The open maw approaches the knight, exposing its huge fangs, and the enemy, not believing what is happening, flying down dumbfounded, stares at them idly. The young man, looking at the opponent with a burning eye, explained that this is not the power of a man, and squeezing the formed liquid, it slips through his fingers. The guy added that the power belongs to the king, and the fire in his opponent's eyes begins to fade. The eyes of the guy opposite burns more and more confidently and scrutinizes the Apocalypse boss. The huge monster created by the guy catches up with the enemy, and with a wide-open fanged mouth spewing energy lightning is about to swallow the enemy. Having swallowed the knight, the monster created by the guy turns into one continuous fireball and at a great speed is carried down, penetrated by black and red lightning. There is an explosion in the air and spiky vines fly in different directions. The guy is thrown down by the shockwave, but he continues to hold back the attacking magic, putting his hand forward and clenching his fist, a new skill, the spirit of the King of Knights. At the exit of the dungeon is a lot of people. Ambulances have arrived. Journalists are interviewing the participants. The street is noisy. 3 examiners stand at the portal and wait for the research teams to return. Finally, the gates rattle. A little excitement begins. A few observers start examining the gate. Puck asks the girl what's wrong with her magic reading. He's clearly nervous. She holds up a scanner and replies that it's ES rank, which stunned the others present. The girl looked at Puck in surprise and said that an evacuation order had been received, and the delay in evacuation was due to the gate distortion. The guy standing next to her added that they couldn't be sure the relief team would arrive before the dungeon broke. The chairman frowned and clenched his teeth, thinking with a blackguard that the dungeon from the DE rank dungeon was phoned with the energy of the ES rank. In that case, no one would survive. Puck's glasses clinked, his gaze became stern, and he suggested that he might have to intervene alone, and a drop of sweat trickled down his cheek. The gate flared and crackled. The watchers tensed up, waiting for further developments and waiting in stunned amazement. Two of the waiting men took a step back, and Puck ducked his knees and raised his arms. And he shouted in astonishment, telling everyone to brace themselves and the group to be frightened by what was happening. The gate continues to make crackling noises, and bright beams and energy discharges appear from it. The watchers stare at the gate in amazement. The guy raised his fists and prepared for battle. The girl took a fighting stance, and Puck opened his mouth in surprise. What he saw stunned him completely, and he mumbled something inaudible questioningly. The gate takes its usual form, and only Hyun comes out to meet the observers, leaving the whole team stunned. The guy is all wounded and dirty, standing there with a smiling face, but with a lost look, and said that by some miracle he got out. Hyun changed his clothes and is asked about the dungeon. Thanks to him, the double gate situation was resolved. The examiners did the evacuation without serious damage, and it was decided that the results of this round will be based on the scores received earlier. The current player Ma died and was placed in a coffin, as well as the rest of the bodies of the deceased were found and handed over to their families safe and sound. The Players Association decided not to reveal who cleaned up the apocalypse because they had to face the negative press. But if they tell, the consequences will be unpredictable. The senior chairman calls the manager and the examiner over to him. They stand with their heads bowed and hands folded behind their backs, and the boss says obviously Kim Tae-hyun will be the main target of not only the media, but the villains. Go and Park looked like they were waiting for this, and both smiled in agreement with the chairman, saying that there was nothing they could do about it, because of course they understood. The chairman thanked those present, folded his hands and put his elbows on the table, a black patch over one of his eyes, and he continued. An old man sits at the table and makes himself comfortable. He asks the examiners what they think about all this. They are stretched out in a string, not knowing what to answer. The man sits down, and on his desk are rebuses, and he added that they were thinking of Kim Tae-hyun. No, not like that. The man who cleaned up the S-rank dungeon apocalypse. Park smiled broadly and replied uncertainly, that guy had cleared the S-rank dungeon with his own strength, so he was now at the level of an S-ranked player. The manager looked down with an absent look and tiredly said that although his current rank was the worst, he possessed a strength that was hard to estimate. The chairman looked at the examiners carefully, waiting for the continuation. He wondered what would come of all this. The manager and the examiner glanced at each other, looking at each other, waiting for one of them to think of something to answer. After all, there was a high chance that he might be of national rank. In the red sky, the moon overlaps the sun. There has been a solar eclipse. A guy stands exhaling heavily under falling rocks, his face all covered in drops of sweat. Along the path comes a crowd of various monsters. They growl with their mouths wide open, raising dust and swinging their paws. The boy stands back and watches as many different monsters pass by him. The young man stands on the cliff and wonders where the monsters are coming from. They are walking purposefully forward. Something catches the guy's attention and he looks away, thinking why he is in the abyss. Hyun stands on the cliff, turns around with his arm back, and looked in the direction the monsters are moving. Raising his head, he looks at the solar eclipse and sees a white king floating in the center of it. The king's face is half covered by his hair. His arms are down. He is emitting a bright light, and rocks are falling from above. The boy recoiled and took a step back. He looked at the king in surprise. Continuing to float in the air, the king raises his hand slightly and puts his index finger out. Against the background of the eclipse, he illuminates everything around him, and the monsters are furious and growl loudly, opening their fanged mouths and clawed paws trying to reach him. The white king with curly hair stretches his hand forward, palm down, and a haze appears in it, gathering into a transparent white ball. The white haze passes through the king's fingers, further illuminating the hand. With a smooth sweep of his hand, the king creates a beam of light that quickly flies over the monsters, and they begin to split into molecules and like white petals begin to rise into. With a smooth sweep of his hand, the boy is dumbfounded as he stares at what is happening from the cliff. It is illuminated by the bright light of the king, and from under the cliff rise white clubs from the once former monsters. The young man turns his dumbfounded gaze back to the king. He is so surprised that his eyes become huge and his mouth opens involuntarily, and drops of sweat appear on his face. The thick clouds begin to part, and the king, having destroyed the monsters, begins to rise into the sky illuminated by a bright light. He said that he would wait, and the guy's legs gave out. He lifted his arms in amazement, looking at the king. The lad stands with eyes wide open and mouth open, illuminated by the blinding light, and the king said he would wait in the most hidden corners of the abyss. Small stones flew noisily past the king, and he gave one last smile, the hair on his forehead beginning to turn blood red. The young man woke up in bed in a cold sweat. He opened his eyes wide in amazement and breathed heavily, realizing that it was only a dream. He looked up at the ceiling with a dazed look and couldn't come to his senses. As he exhaled, he spread his arms across the mattress, as if trying to keep his balance. Hyun sat up on the bed and looked down at his arm, his pajamas open and his bandaged chest exposed, the light from the window flooding the room. The guy's dream was so realistic that the guy can't believe it and continues to look at the raised palms sitting on the hospital bed. The guy continues to look at the palms spreading his fingers. Drops of sweat run down his hand and he thinks to himself that this can't be happening. Too realistic for a normal dream. The boy froze on the bed with his hand up, still looking at it. The White King appears behind his back, holding out his hands to him. Hyun doesn't see him and wonders what he meant by saying that he will be waiting for him. The guy remembers the image of a death knight. There is a drop of sweat on his face and his teeth are clenched, and he thinks that even S-rank monsters are wary of being hunted. Besides, he can understand their language and the questions are getting bigger. Hyun turned to the side, leaning one hand on the bed and activated the skill board. His eyes widened as he thought that it turns out, getting stronger and getting into the abyss is the only way. The young man smiled as he looked at the scoreboard and thought that he knew it. With the Night King's spirit invocation, you can overpower the enemy with your spirit. He had a suspicion during the battle with the Night King, but he had really increased his rank. The boy looked at his stats again and decided that with those stats he could compete with S-ranked players, and thought about the spirit of the Night King. He was sure that it was the skill that was pushing him with that terrifying power. The young man smiled at his thoughts, and one eyebrow crept upwards. He thought that at this rate, a national level rank is not far off. The door to the ward closed tightly, and there was a loud knock. The guy turned around and stared questioningly at the door silently. The guy opened his mouth in surprise, looking at the door with his eyes wide open, as he heard a protest that they weren't allowed to enter here for nothing. The door slowly began to creak open, and from behind it came a voice that said, calling out to the gods, that he couldn't believe that they would forbid them from visiting a sick person. The guy's face covered with sweat and his widened with stunned expression when the voice behind the door said that even for the chairman of the association, it was too much. Finally, the door opened fully, and in walked the head of the Vagabonds Guild holding onto the door handle. Lowering his eyes, he asked if the guy thought the same, and behind her lay squirming in pain the guards looking after the guy. The girl raised her head, on her face a warm sparkling look and a sweet smile, the rays of the sun rainbow on her chest. She looked at the guy, calling him darling. Life in the city goes on its way. On the street, passers-by go about their business and cars go by. In the stream of cars stands out one, black with a shiny surface. On the back seat sits the driver of this car, and covered with sweat, humbly folding his hands on a pile of things, and hesitantly says, addressing the head, that it may be better for him to drive the car, but that in response heard the order to sit and enjoy. The girl sitting behind the wheel continued smiling that he was her guest after all, so let the driving be left to her. Hyun boredly sitting in the next seat and looking away. The guy, without turning his head towards the head, propped his chin with his hand and said the first phrase after a long silence. The girl looked at him in surprise with one eye. Hyun turned his head, looked down at the girl, and warily asked what the head of the Vagabonds, one of the strongest guilds, needed from him. The head continued to drive and focused on the road, answering with a groan. Didn't she say that she would just take him home after the discharge, and at the same time see who he was, since he was able to survive the apocalypse? The young man, smiling smugly, looked at the girl and asked how the head of one of the leading guilds could have such primitive reasons, and asked her to think of something more believable. The driver sitting in the back jaw dropped from such insolence. The head smilingly looked at the guy and noticed that his tongue is sharp, and decided to share the information. The driver behind froze, covered with sweat. The girl asked if the boy knew what happened during the third round of the qualifiers, and thus puzzled the boy. The head continued smiling and looking at the road that the third round was also a game of survival, but unlike the first round, outsiders could watch. The girl glanced furtively at the guy and said that his powers were on display, and now all the guilds would start hunting for a low-ranked awakened past S-rank dungeon. The smile is gone from the guy's face, and he silently watches the head of the guild with his eyes alone, leaning back on the headrest of the seat. The head of the Vagabond Guild gracefully extended her hand to the lad and said that she was asking him to listen to her offer before refusing. The girl smilingly placed her hand on the armrest, reaching out to the lad for a handshake. She asked about money and fame, and added that she would give him anything he wanted, so she offered to join the Vagabonds. The guy calmly looked at the outstretched hand and didn't move. He wasn't even surprised at such an offer. The head looks expectantly at the lad in response with a soft smile and a twinkle in his eyes. The young man looks at the girl with his eyes alone without turning his head, contemplating her offer. There was a tense silence in the car. The driver in the back seat closed his eyes and closed his lips, drenching himself in sweat. Finally, the young man turned his head towards the girl and with a tired look said that he was not interested. Hearing the refusal, the driver from the back seat moved forward. Over the city, a surprised cry of not understanding the refusal was heard from both the head and the driver at the same time. The boy was given a ride to his house, the empty streets not a soul and only lanterns burning. The young man walked down a narrow alley, folded his hands in his pockets and thanked them for taking him there. And then he would get there on his own. The head of the Vagabond Guild jumped out of the car with the driver when the guy went down the steps and asked why. The young man turned around and raised his head up in silence. The girl looked at the guy seriously and poked her finger at him, asking if he didn't hear what she said, if it was the salary and he had other conditions, and she repeated that she was willing to do anything for him. The guy silently listens to the tirade of the head, who continues to be inundated with questions. Maybe he already got an offer from another guild, or realized something was wrong and he thought it was starting to get annoying. The young man finally asked that they did not misunderstand him, because there was no special reason for refusal. And the girl was silent, surprised, watching the guy. The guy standing on the steps added that there is no other guild, no conditions, and whether the vagabonds are so special, the girl listens to him clenched fists. Without turning away from his pursuers, the young man smiled warmly and began to continue down the stairs, noting that he is simply not interested in this. The girl stands opening her mouth with the urge to say something when the guy says now he's gone. The young man lowers himself down, shuffling his shoes down the steps and putting his hands in his pockets. A bright light begins to shine behind him, and his shadow falls on the alley wall. The guy continues to walk away with a smile on his face and a satisfied look. The head of the Vagabond Guild abruptly extends his arm forward, splitting the air. In a flash, the girl is behind the guy's back, blocking his mouth with her hand and twisting one of his arms. The young man dazedly grabs her wrist and tries to break free, but the girl tilts her head, holding him even tighter. The guy turns his head at the girl with his nose and mouth blocked, trying to resist but sees, the head being covered by a turquoise aura. The head reprimanded and asked the guy what was wrong with him without loosening her grip. Her eyes lit up with the color of her aura, and she looked at him with a furious look, and the guy uncomprehendingly tries to look at her. The aura covered the girl all over her body, and she took a step forward on the step, said that just a guy took the first step to become a player, and already he is refusing one of the 4 great guilds, just because, and it doesn't make any sense. The girl finally removes her aura-covered hand from the guy's mouth and he opens it to gulp in air. Covered in sweat, the girl added that this time she forgives him. The head turned the sweaty head of the guy to herself, pressed him to her shoulder and ran her index finger on his cheek, and covering both of them with energy, said that she forgives him only because she likes him, and the guy gritted his teeth. The driver at the top of the stairs panicked and raised his hands, shouted to the guild head, "What is she doing since the guy is still being tested? What the hell is she doing?" And the girl keeps holding the guy. The man shouted and turned to Hyun and asked him not to piss off the head and just accept her invitation. He would have to join the guild someday. The boy stopped resisting and smiled, saying that now he could see that stubbornness ran in the family. Hyun relaxed, smiled smugly, looking at the head, clarified, asking her if Lim Ayun's sister was like that, which dumbfounded her. The girl looked at the smiling guy with huge eyes of surprise and asked where he was from. The young man continued to smile and pulled away from the head and added that he knew a lot of things about the stolen name among them. The girl, dumbfounded by what she heard, opened her eyes wide and opened her mouth in surprise. The girl jerked her gaze back to the boy and furrowed her brow. Night had already fallen on the city, and the streets were deserted, with only a few lanterns burning. Suddenly, a turquoise-colored pillar rises between the streets with a loud pop, and a shockwave went through the roofs of the houses. The pillar went wild and covered everything around with a powerful aura. It grabbed the guy by the throat, which scared the driver, who recoiled and raised his hands in amazement. The man thought to himself that this is bad and tensed up, all covered in bad. The man recalled a photo of the girl as a baby and thought that the head's real name was actually Lim Ayun. The CEO of Yuksan Group raised the girl born out of wedlock as his heir. But when another daughter came into the family, the father took away the head's name and made the girl an outcast. The girl kept clutching the guy's throat and clenching her fists. The man thought that the people who know that she changed her last name after becoming a player can be counted on their fingers. The head looked fiercely at the guy with burning eyes and started to lift him off the ground, asking how dare he talk such nonsense right in front of her, and he was definitely crazy, wasn't he? The guy dumbfounded the girl with his words. When he said that, they started first. His eyes rounded and burning pupils became narrower, and his mouth involuntarily opened. The young man applies the skill of hunting. He starts to smile, his eye lights up, and he is covered with his aura. Intercepting the hand of the chapter, she feels the resistance of the unknown force to the spirit of the Amazons, and it was successful. Hyun counterattacks with the spirit of the Night King, and the attack was successful. The girl groaned and bounced to the side. Her aura is interrupted by the guy's energy with his spiky vines hitting all ends. The girl looked dumbfounded at the young man, thinking what a power. Her hand shaking after his touch and red spiky vines flying past her. The head thought in amazement. Not only was he able to withstand S-ranked players' ability, but the counterattacker now stood with one hand shoved in his pocket and the other looking at his vines, folding his lips into a tube and blowing on them. The guy folded his hands behind his back and looked smugly at the girl. The spiky vines were behind his back, covering his shoulders like a voluminous cloak. The head of the Vagabond Guild recoiled and looked down at the guy with astonished eyes, involuntarily opening her mouth. The young man stepped forward one step closer to the head. The guy came close to the girl, swung and elbowed her over the head of the head. Keeping one hand in his pocket, she pressed her whole body against the wall and mesmerized, looking straight into the guy's eyes. The guy smiled smugly and suggested not crossing the line and called her big sister Ayun, then corrected himself and called her Mrs. Ayun, continuing to hold her between his torso and the wall. The girl kept her eyes on the guy, bit her lower lip. Her gaze changed, and she blushed with a hoarse exhale. The driver was confused, clenched his fists, and opened his mouth, wondering if the guy had just said that. Outside the city stands a huge stadium with a bustling crowd of people stretching towards it. The Colosseum, reminiscent of ancient Rome, is the venue for the third round, with digital scoreboards all over the hall and almost all the seats already filled with spectators. The host girl holds a microphone in her hands and smilingly informs that, unlike the first two rounds, closed to outside spectators, the third round they can watch with their own eyes. The manager and the examiner stand on the balcony with different facial expressions, and the girl added, "So the future colleagues of the awakened, their families and ordinary citizens of their country, have arrived at the arena to see the preliminaries with their own eyes." The head sat down in the rows of spectators, pretending to be an ordinary spectator with popcorn in her hands, nervously eating it, thinking about Hyun, glaring at the arena with burning eyes. Her uncle and aunt sit on the bleachers, saying that thanks to Hyun, they can be spectators too. The woman asks if everything will be okay. She's heard that sectionals can be very violent, with her cousin watching from the sidelines. Jin laughed confidently and put his arms at his sides and patted his jacket with supportive inscriptions for his brother, saying that there was no reason to worry because Dion was very strong. The guy put out his index finger and hit the inside of the elbow of his other arm with one hand. He brightens up, smiling and believing in his brother, saying he can take everyone out with one punch. Jin has become the president of Hyun's fan club and is the only member of the club. He is so fired up that he throws his leg over the bleachers and waves his arms, and a journalist with glasses and sweat comes rushing in. Kim Ji-cha, a young journalist on the verge of being fired, she was desperately biting her thumbnail and thought that this time she had to find a scoop. The girl took a seat on the bench, folded her hands on top of each other, resting her head on them. She was shaking, as her last interview was rejected due to a low-ranked awakened being there. Her work thrown at her, and asked what they should do about it. The girl looked up, her eyes filling with tears, and she thought that that guy, Kim Tae-hyun, must have gotten out by now. And if she can't get an interview this time too, she'll definitely say goodbye to the job. Kim is sitting there taking off his glasses and wiping his tears with his hands. He hears the guy sitting next to him ask his companion if she thinks the atmosphere is strange and points his hand forward, and the journalist looks up. The girl looked questioningly at the arena to understand why the atmosphere was strange and saw Hyun standing alone in the center, and the other participants parted, creating a semicircle around the guy. Some tensely recoiled. Kim's tears dried up. She went to the fence, putting her hands on it, and looked at what was happening in the arena in surprise. The girl wondered, from the veterans among the high-ranked awakened ones to Lee Gil-san. A ranked candidate, behaving unusually, they looked away in surprise. One bit his lip. All the people present at the preliminaries are looking in the same direction, with burning gazes and rubbing their hands, preparing for a fight. Gradually surrounding the guy, everyone stares at him, some taking a step back, some adopting a fighting stance, and some just staring with surprised eyes. The girl stunned thought, with her mouth open, that they all want to deal with him by joining forces. Then how strong is he? Watching what was going on in the arena, Kim looked forward questioningly. She heard that the third round of preliminaries was about to begin. A sinister smile appeared on the unknown man's face. He is waiting in the noisy hall for the game to begin. Hyun stands with his hands folded in his pockets, head slightly tilted, surrounded by the other contestants, as the hostess addressed all the spectators in the arena, asking them to remain calm regardless of what they might see here. Finally, the presenter said that the testing was about to begin, and the guy cheerfully raised his face with a satisfied smile and a serious look, for he was a C-ranked awakened who had defeated the S rank and received the B rank. The first to attack is the girl with burning eyes. She stretches her arms forward and hits with air magic. 3 contestants with different skills enter the battle next, their faces covered in drops of sweat. The contestants all start attacking at the same point. A multicolored stream of energies formed in the arena due to different magic, and a ball of magic builds up in the center. The 3 guys continue their onslaught, and one of them says that they need to deal with Hyun now because he defeated the 2 S-ranked ones in the first round alone. And the other 2 start to intensify their attack while clenching their teeth and looking ahead carefully. On the other side, the candidates also keep hitting the same point, noting that if they don't knock the guy out now, he will take them all out. The magic accumulated in the ball starts to break through with discharges that start bouncing off in different directions, along with the rocks. Continuing the onslaught, none of the participants noticed a gap in the magic ball, and out popped a guy with a burning eye, with one hand stretched forward and the other clenched into a fist. The participants on whom Hyun flew out were dumbfounded by what was happening. They bounced back with screams. All 3 of them stared forward with their mouths open and arms folded in defense and stopped attacking in fright. Hyun, with a smug smile, covers his body with stone skin and rushes at the guys with a clenched fist, his hand electrified. The first blow of crushing force hit the guy on the right side of his face and he flew backward sharply. The second one was struck with several lightning-fast blows to his chest and arms, and he was knocked unconscious on the fly with his mouth wide open. Broken teeth fly around mixed with blood drops and pebbles. A multicolored energy ball rises in the center of the arena, and the participants begin to fly around it in different directions. Hyun rushes forward at great speed and stops outside the magic ball with one arm stretched forward. The candidates who attacked first fall one by one unconscious into the clouds of raised dust, blood drops, and stones. The guy with a smile stands in the thick of the dust, leaning forward slightly. Suddenly, a cracking sound is heard under the guy's feet, and the ground begins to crumble, a green light glowing in the crack. Hyun pulled back, spreading his arms and bending his knees slightly. Green roots abruptly pop out of the ground and head towards the guy, fragments of stone flying off of them. The roots reached the target and braided the boy's body. Everything around shone with green light. The guy entangled by the roots moved forward and looked at his opponent with a cheerful look, and he asked who they had here. The participant with tree magic appeared in front of the guy and laughed evilly, putting his index finger to his lips, flashing his green burning eyes. He said that Hyun might have defeated 2 AE's rankers, but his carelessness would cost him his life. The opponent smiled smugly, holding his index finger to his lips, looked at the guy with flashing eyes and said that the winner of this round would be him, a ranked genius, Lee Gil-san. Hyun in one fell swoop easily tore the roots braiding him, and with a crushing kick he hit his opponent in the head. He broke through the floor, a column of dust and stones flying in different directions. The light of the opponent faded. Lee crashes through the floor with a grunt. The light in his eyes fades. He opens his mouth wide and his arm falls limply down. The beads around his neck tear and the beads scatter, mixed in with the stones flying around. Hyun continues to tear the roots with light movements and with a wide smile cheerfully ordered his opponent to close his mouth. The participants watching from the side shouted that Hyun is a monster, and orders come in to attack him from all sides without stopping. If they continue like this, he will get tired one day, and Hyun jumps out of the roots and stops next to Lee. Hyun quickly turns around to the talkers with a wide smile and looks down at them and points his finger at them. The guy continues to hold his hand outstretched forward and invokes the spirit of the King of Knights with a smile. The 3 guys rushed forward, and one of them heard the activation of the skill while giving the guy a surprised look. The guy running with the activated skill felt the pressure on him and starts to stop. He looks forward frightened, not realizing what is happening. The attacking guy was covered in sweat. His eyes became dazed and his pupils turned red. He furrowed his eyebrows. His head began to be pressed by an inexplicable force. The Death Knight appeared above Hyun's head, standing with his arm outstretched, his arms spread wide and his mouth open. his body covered with a terrifying aura. The guys running to attack begin to fall one by one, unable to withstand the pressure. The King of Nights makes an eerie sound and is covered by the auras of the guy and his own, exhaling an attacking red beam with his mouth wide open. His appearance is different from what it was before. His eyes don't shine and his crown doesn't shine. The participants felled by the power of the King of Nights can't get up. They are squirming in pain and pressure. Clenching their fists, they crawl and grunt around the tension and flying stones. Hyun's relatives jump up from their seats and stare dumbfounded and sweaty at the arena with their mouths open. A woman clings to her husband's shoulder, and Ji-young walks over to the partition and looks at his brother questioningly in amazement. The manager stares at the arena, with his mouth hanging open in amazement, dumbfounded by what's happening, while the examiner frowns his eyebrows in amusement and grins. Kim is just as stunned as the others. Eyes wide and mouth open, she cried out dumbfounded. The guy with the haughty look, smiling, holds his arm outstretched forward, rocks flying around and tension hanging. The power was so great that it spread to the audience in the hall, and they began to pull away, as if blown away without wind and pressed against the walls of the seats. The leader of the tramps tensed up, set aside the popcorn, and pitched forward to gaze. The girl called Hyun a psycho and raised her hand. She's eyes wide open looking at the arena, outraged that he used a skill in the middle of nowhere. The guy is standing on the floor covered in cracks, the dust gradually dissipating and exposing the defeated contestants who still lay curled up, the grim aura shards flying around and slowly fading away. Hyun exhaled, folded his hands in his pockets, and slowly walked between the defeated opponents, saying that perhaps this was the end of it. The guy stopped in the clouds of dust and looked away with a smile, saying that there is unfinished business. Out of the dust clouds comes Ah-yoon holding one hand with her other hand, moving and shuffling her feet heavily. The guy half-turned and watches her. The rest of the participants continue to lie motionless. The girl breathing heavily stopped, continuing to hold her wounded arm and looking straight at the guy with serious eyes. She is enveloped by dust and sparks of fire flying by. The guy turned around, still keeping his hands in his pockets. He stands in the thick of the soot and dust, smiling. Looking at the girl, he asked her what she planned to do now, and added that he wouldn't be offended at all if she decided to surrender. The girl looked at Hyun carefully. A drop of sweat dripped down her face, and she bent her torso slightly, leaning forward, still holding her hand clenched. The arena is so dusty and sooty that you can't see part of the stadium. The guy smiles smugly. He looks at the girl with a calm look. Rocks and sparks are flying around, and he decides to provoke the girl by asking if she wants to refresh her memories of the first round. And Yoon instantly blushes, furrows her eyebrows, and glares furiously at the guy. She starts to get angry and embarrassed. There was a rumble, and up flew a powerful wave of blue energy, accompanied by ice blocks. Seals in the form of snowflakes begin to appear around. The next strongest wave flew in the opposite direction, also mixed with ice. The seals are becoming more and more, and the hall is filled with the sound of breaking ice blocks. In a flash, an ice dome formed in the arena, raising airwaves around it. The dome begins to form a crust of ice, hiding from the audience what is happening inside. The crackle of growing ice is heard, and the seals in the form of snowflakes increased in size. The girl furiously shouted Hyun's name, drawing all of his attention to herself. He stands with his hands in his pockets and smiles confusedly, a drop of sweat dripping down his face, and he thought, wondering that now he doesn't care about Ah-yoon's lunge. Ah-yoon became furious and shouted furiously, advising the guy to take better care of himself. An airwave rose around her. Her eyes lit up and she activated her huge ice hammer, spreading her legs wide and prepared to attack. The girl moved forward with burning eyes. Her face was filled with rage. She furrowed her eyebrows and shouted that she would never do it again. The hammer in her hand shone, and energy began to build up around her, and flakes of snow flew around her. The guy stands in the epicenter of the storm. Around him the air rises and flakes of snow fly. He smiles smugly. In his look reads mockery, and smugly mocked the girl, saying yes what she says. All around, everything crackles with the growing ice. A real blizzard rises. Ice blocks start to build up everywhere, and small drifts of snow appear. Flakes of snow fly in the blizzard. Ice blocks glisten. You can't see anything around because of the blizzard. Part of the cracked floor peeks through the snow curtain, and the girl's hammer with a broken handle stuck in the floor. The girl's blue hair flutters in the airwaves inside the dome, mixed with snow and ice shards from the blocks. Hyung stands as if he hasn't moved, his hands still in his pockets. his hands covered in frost and a sad expression on his face, while the girl walks past him with a surprised look and is about to fall. The blizzard continues. Ice shards and flakes of snow falling. The girl falls at Hyun's feet on the cracked floor unconscious with a distinctive sound. The guy from above looks at her with his hands out and clenched fists. The girl lay with her eyes closed, lips closed, and a drop of sweat dripping down her cheek. Her right arm resting above her head, and her hair spread in a circle, flakes of snow and ice shards falling on her. The boy exhaled and stretched forward a shaking hand. His palm was covered in a thin layer of ice, and he noted that he expected nothing less. Snow and ice continued to fall all around. The space was filled with a snowy haze. The young man moved his gaze from his hand to the girl and said that she is still his most difficult opponent. The guy's body continues to be covered with hoarfrost, and the blizzard still does not calm down. The announcer announces that the third round is over. The snow dome dissipates, and the guy is left standing in the arena. The crowd jumped up from their seats with resounding cheers. Candidate number 920 Kim Dae-hyun is the winner of these qualifiers. The chairman sits at the table with a cup of steaming tea and says that, by the way, he didn't think the guy would single-handedly finish third, and laughingly adds that given the sweep of the apocalypse, it was to be expected. Hyun sits in the chair opposite, a cup of hot tea in front of him, holding a dagger in his hand and bowing his head, smiling with feigned modesty, replied that he was just lucky. The man continued to smile and leaned forward slightly, a black patch over his eye, gray hair showing through his hair and beard. He kept his elbows on the table, folding his hands together. The chairman addressed the guy by name, which caught his attention, and Hyun raised a questioning look at him, expecting a tricky question. The man asked how Hyun felt about the offer to join the new South Korea Players Association, which stunned the guy, and he froze in surprise, staring at the chairman with his mouth open and his hands hanging in the air. The guy stares at the chairman with his mouth open, his eyes rounded and sweat dripping down his face. The dagger he was holding in his hands fell on the table, and his hands rested on the table. The winner's cup and untouched tea on the table. Dust particles fly in the sunlit space. The guy who froze at the words of the chairman rounded his eyes and sits with his mouth open, raising his eyebrows when the chairman continued by asking if he wants to work for the association. The man froze, waiting for an answer. There was a heavy silence in the room. He pressed his lips to the folded hands in front of him and looked expectantly at the guy seriously and attentively, keeping his eyes on him. The guy looked at the winner's cup, which stands on the participant's form, on which his name is engraved, decorated with a yin-yang sign in red and blue, and he thought that, honestly, a lot has changed. The young man recalled his battles with the best opponents and thought about the fact that an underdog like him became a ranked player and even took first place at the qualifiers. Hyun received a personal invitation not only from the leader of a great guild, but also from Chae Jin-wi himself, the strongest of the new South Korea Association. The man sits waiting for an answer. Tension hung in the room. He lowered his folded hands in front of him and looks expectantly at the guy, keeping his eyes on him. The guy smiled and thought, goody. Just when he thinks he has it all figured out, he gets hit on the head. The boy is still thinking and reaches for the cup of tea, which is still hot and steaming. The boy bows his head and picks up the cup and replies that he would prefer to refuse, which discouraged the chairman. The man jumped out of his seat and shouted in rage how this could be, while the guy, sitting calmly in his seat, said that there was no particular reason for refusal. The guy, smiling, added that he just believed that unlike becoming a member of one of the 4 great guilds or association, and fell silent, picking up his mug of tea. The guy continued with a smile that he would do more good on his own, holding the cup in his hand, his dagger and his questionnaire in front of him. The guy apologized and said he couldn't help, and the chairman glared at him and froze in amazement, still not touching his tea. The chairman grinned and stretched in a smile, a drop of sweat running down his cheek.